On. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwestern Marx live stream. Today, I roped Noah and Carlos both into joining me. So thank you, comrades. Happy that you're here. We're going to be talking about the war in Iraq, Elon Musk's new company town that he wants to build, and also Mark Zuckerberg and Meta laying off 21,000 employees and giving a really cold and unfeeling speech to the employees about efficiency and making the organization as lean as possible. So there have been some interesting reactions to that from corporate media. Without further ado, I guess we'll play our intro and get into it. Hello, how's it going, guys? First thing I want to ask you have you ever flown over Washington, D.C. or into Washington, D.C.?
Yes. My wife and I took a trip there a year ago, I think, 2 years ago, maybe. I know, time's kind of a blur.
Right.
But yeah.
Did you pay close attention to the ground?
No.
You didn't try and spot anything?
No, what do you mean?
I mean, I was just trying to see if I could see like the White House or the Capitol building or the Lincoln Memorial, and I didn't see anything other than just some of the largest houses that I've ever seen in my life and a bunch of golf courses and a bunch of pretty much lakes attached to people's houses that look like private lakes. So I guess that's where all of our tax dollars are going. It was interesting for a simple Midwesterner like me to get the chance to go and fly over the big city in a plane and see all the money that they have. I felt like the Bolsheviks when they broke into the Tsar's palace and were just stunned by all the luxurious wealth.
It's like a reverse flyover, right? Like we're usually the flyover guys, but we're flying out. Yeah. On my trip, we had some friends in DC who took us to a few of the tourist sites, and we went to some on our own, but we stayed right in Chinatown. And this is interesting. During the Sino-Soviet split period, Beijing and DC were sister cities, right? And Beijing, or the Communist Party, donated this giant arch to DC that was right outside our hotel building. And it's got like a big hammer and sickle on the engraving on it, which I thought was pretty cool. Like just sitting there in DC where we watched people get beaten up by the cops. It was, quite a statement. But also we got to see where Lincoln got killed or got shot and the Lincoln Memorial. And what's crazy is the Ford Theater where Lincoln got shot is right next to the FBI headquarters, which I thought is kind of another statement, right? Like one of our most revolutionary figures in our country's history, next to, one of the most counter-revolutionary organizations in history. And I won't ramble on about it, but yeah, it's the rest of DC from what I saw is exactly how you describe it, though. It's just mansions, and then when you go a few feet outside of them, slums.
Right.
I have found that it's one of the easiest things to use in order to just show regular people how the government is bought off by capital, and how, what socialists want when they talk about the government is something qualitatively different. In my intro to philosophy class, I mean, I don't know how I get away with this, but I do. I teach all sorts of stuff, but two of the things that I teach are Lenin's the first chapter of State and Revolution, and then Che Guevara's Socialism and Man in Cuba. And two of the things that usually stand out to people who live in this country, where the average politician makes 250K, and if you're Nancy Pelosi, you got insider tradings, and if most of them have a bunch of funders and donors, and the vast majority of them are just millionaires. One of the first things that stands out is the claim that under socialism, the government representatives, the representatives of the people, are going to have to make the salary of an average worker, because it's just so easy to get them to understand how it is that people that are making 10, 15 times as much as the average American, or sometimes more, are not going to be able to empathize with the struggles of the average American, and therefore not be able to represent them correctly. So it's one of those entry points that I think it's very easy to help people transition from thinking critically about why is it that the Speaker of the House does insider trading and it's a millionaire, and et cetera, et cetera, and how can that be different in another qualitatively different form of society.
Yeah, there's stock traders who literally recommend paying attention to what Nancy Pelosi does, because she's got like the most accurate prediction. Whatever share she buys is what's going to rise. Right. Right. So one of one of my favorite TikToks that I ever did was outside the JFK Memorial in Fort Worth, Texas, where he was killed, talking about the conspiracy around his death and the CIA and some of the Michael Parenti lectures and essays that he's done on it. And of course, that was deleted forever by the NATO operatives who run TikTok. So rest in peace to those videos. But yeah, I also talked to my buddy who's an engineer this week, and he works at an engineer at a huge manufacturing plant in town. And I like talking to engineers because their job is to make production more efficient, right? So they're directly related to production. They're constantly thinking about production, and I guess you could classify them as working class. A lot of times, like at John Deere, where there was a huge strike this summer, the manufacturing workers, the workers in the factory and the plant, are unionized, and they were the ones going on strike, and the engineers tend to not be unionized. So that kind of puts their interests at odds with the workers a little bit, but not a lot, because although a lot of engineers did end up like scabbing essentially and going and working in the manufacturing plants during the strikes, they understood that if the workers get better benefits, that's going to mean better benefits and wages for the engineers. So, ultimately they're working class. But it's just so interesting talking to my buddy. He was talking about the plant is designed, or the plant where the manufacturing workers are at is designed for efficiency, in terms of profit, in terms of surplus value. We know that capitalist production processes are designed to make surplus value, not essentially do things in a way that are safe and, most efficient in terms of the human beings involved. It's more just efficiency in terms of profit. And he even talked about people who have died in the plant, who the workers have memorials for like once a year now. And discussed that, and also discussed how a lot of what he does, a lot of his mental labor and time and energy as an engineer is spent researching intellectual property laws and researching what patents exist on certain products. Because he'll come up with something, like pretty easy, like I should use this bolt with this screw. But then, some company has a patent on it. So he says he literally has to make the bolt into like a triangle. And that's how you circumvent the patents, and do what you want to do. But it's like, how inefficient, right? Like we talk about capitalism being a fetter on production. Like that is private ownership, companies wanting to use their inventions, use these ideas they come up with to make money. They want to place a price tag on their ideas. prevent anyone else from using them to make money, any competitors from using them. And it makes production less efficient. It makes production as a whole, and that he works in water, right? Like he works in an industry that builds like pipes that brings water to people's houses. Works together with the city, so it's like why not just nationalize this, make the workplace more safe, and then let the engineers, do things in the way that maximizes efficiency. Instead, we have all this bureaucracy and red tape preventing efficiency. And we also have the situation where they try and make the engineers' economic interests different than the workers' interests by not letting them unionize. So it was an interesting conversation. I got to spend like 4 hours in the car with that guy. And my brother's also going to be an engineer. And I bought him a copy of Capital to read when he graduates. So hopefully he'll let me know more. But
it's do you want to go, Carlos?
Sure. I just have a quick point that it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's like I guess across American companies, they too are affected by intellectual property laws, but especially the third world, the global South and East, and one of the big functions of imperialism in keeping countries poor has been hoarding intellectual property, and the scientific and technological development that certain civilizations in the West have been able to make. They hoard it for themselves, and that's one of the things that perhaps Marx kind of predicted wrongly. His idea was that capitalism, because it was progressive at a specific stage, once it expanded beyond its borders and went elsewhere, it was also going to have negative effects, but eventually positive ones, in the sense that it was going to help develop those areas. And we've seen with imperialism that the opposite is true, and intellectual property is one of those main ones. And part of the special thing that China has done since reform and opening up is that it didn't just open itself up to capital, but it made it very explicit in the contracts that the reason why they were doing that, or one of the conditions for doing that, was them being able to have the intellectual property of the stuff that's being developed in their country. So that's in part why China has been able to develop in the sciences and technologies and in all these different areas, to a scale never before seen in human history. But it also manifests itself in a variety of areas. Academic articles, right? I'm in the academy, and there's still the vast majority of databases that I cannot have access to unless I send 3 emails to different people, and it gets back to me in 3, 4, 5 days. And it's a whole a bunch of extra steps of bureaucracy that are, when you're in the middle of writing a paper and you find the paper that you want to read or at least skim for something, and you have to wait 3 to 4 days in order for it to come in. It's just it's so inconvenient. And that's that I'm within the academy. With people that are without the academy, they don't have access to these resources that we have when you're in school. So it's a complete fetter. It's an obstacle to the development of basically every area of society, whether it's science, technology, knowledge in general, pretty much everything, not just production.
Yeah, it's, what always strikes me as kind of wild. They talk about how capitalism inspires innovation and creation, but this is precisely holding that back, not allowing people to innovate. And, Eddie's friend, the engineer, comes up with a simple way of fastening something, a simple certain screw attached to a certain nut, and that's it, right? But there's a patent on doing that. That's insane to me. China doesn't have those laws, by the way. And left over from the Soviet era, Russia also doesn't have intellectual property laws. And this allows innovation to really flourish because people aren't prevented from doing what they need to make a given process more innovative and more efficient. My wife actually works with the Russian state library system, and she's always laughing because there are so many generic versions of American books because they don't have that. There's like 20 different Harry Potters. There's Ivan the Boy Wizard, and Alexander and his magic wand, and all that kind of stuff.
That's funny. I also want to point out that the intellectual property regime in healthcare and the way that it stops innovation in medicine is one of the major topics of my article in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too. And like Carlos was saying, with the way this affects the third world through the hoarding of patents and intellectual property, one of the major failures in the global COVID response was the vaccine apartheid that was enforced using or by Western pharmaceutical companies using apparatuses like the World Trade Organization, which have been captured by finance capital, and were used to not only prevent these third world countries or developing countries, whatever you want to call them, from importing the vaccine, buying them from the West, but it also stopped them from creating them. Right. It's an intellectual property law, meaning we own this idea. So you can't even use our vaccine recipe, which forced Cuba to literally create their own vaccine recipe, which they then couldn't administrate as much as they wanted to because the embargo blocked syringes from getting to the island. But nevertheless, more on intellectual property there. And one of the main ways that capitalism acts as a fetter on production in modern day and as a fetter on everything, as Carlos said. You can see that in the legal system. Like we have these legal apparatuses like the World Trade Organization that are, invented to enforce these things, invented to enforce intellectual property laws, Western intellectual property laws on the global South, things like that. So, yeah. Anything else you guys want to talk about before we jump into the Iraq War? Do you want to hit on the Michigan thing first, or?
Yeah, I think that's fairly big. It's a historic win for our friends in Michigan. We have people who are friends of ours at the front lines of the struggle against the right to work laws and repeal those. And as most things in this form of life, they're stamped with names that make them sound really nice. Whether it's
Carlos, let me interrupt you real quick. I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what happened. Do you want to give like a broad?
yeah. I'm getting to that.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry.
Let him unfold his argument dialectically, Noah.
Sorry.
But yeah, it's like the word flexibility, right? It sounds real nice, but all it means is that the capitalist can f you easier. But the right to work, it's got a nice name. It even sounds like universal jobs or like a right to a job or something, right? Things that would come in within a socialist program, but in reality, they're tied to this 1947 bill, the Taft-Hartley Act, which completely destroyed the labor movement. And at the time, it was protested against. And the laborers who were fighting against it were calling it the Slave Labor Act. And this was in the post-war period, the supposed golden age of America. But it's in that area of the late 40s where the vast majority, the amount of strikes were more than ever before in American history. The rate of strikes per the period was more than ever. And a lot of these laws have been repealed in many states in the country. There's many other states that still have them in place. Iowa is one of them that has them in place. In Iowa, teachers can't unionize. They can't do the basic things that are like the precondition for workers once they're organized to fight to improve their conditions. And so our comrades over in Michigan were fighting against these laws over there, and they actually won and were able to repeal those right to work laws. And that's pretty huge because it really it destroys one of the major blows to the American labor movement that we've had in place in a large number of states for the last 70 years now. So.
Yeah, that it's been an ongoing struggle and still is in many states across the country. That right there was UFCW, which is kind of the grocers union in Michigan, taking over the state house to demand the repeal of right to work, which, the bourgeois class sort of bills, like Carlos was saying, is this nice thing. Everyone has a right to work, right? But what it does is weakens the working class and our ability to fight for a higher wage by allowing what's called free riders. Basically, people who take advantage of all of the benefits that we fight for while not contributing at all, sort of parasitically existing on the backs of everyone else. A lot like the boss. It allows the boss to bring in scabs really easily, right? It allows them to sort of undercut the entire union at a shop by having them work side by side with non-union workers. And they get to pay the non-union workers less, get to put in less safety precautions, etc. And so like the party was involved in this. The UFCW locals were involved in, I forget which two right now, so I apologize. They actually, one of our friends who was there and took that photo, sent a video that I wish I could have gotten to work, but I can't figure out my new phone because I'm old. It's the whole state house just chanting "Scabs go home" because there were some, paid protesters coming to try to break them up and counter protest. It's just so happy for them. This is a real win for the entire working class of Michigan, and it's just a start.
I remember the first time I learned what right to work actually means and being stunned, being like, what? That's the opposite. It's as Cobra Commander says here, right to work really means right to fire. That's exactly what it is. And it's like a dialectical inversion. It's like the form of appearance that the law gives is you have this right to work. We're giving you something. And really it means, that that's all you have is the right to work. You don't have the right to anything else. We can literally do with you what we will at any point. As someone who went through that process of losing a job lately, and, two of my best friends as well, that's what the lawyers told all of us. Like, there's really no wrongful termination lawsuit you can do anymore because, even if you're successful, your legal fees are going to cost way more than whatever you win. And in a right to work state, like most of the Midwest, there's just nothing you can do. They can literally fire you for whatever they want. So, I mean, it is a huge win, like you said, and solidarity with them for sure. I remember Carlos and I at Loras had a philosophy professor who I think he was from East Europe. So he really didn't like the Soviet Union and wasn't a socialist. But like the one thing that we talked about in that class, it was a business ethics philosophy class that I had with him, which was interesting to say the least. But the one time where he showed his bias in that class was when he talked about right to work. And he was basically like, this is bullshit. Like, I'm not a socialist, but this is, ridiculous. The law means the opposite of what it says. So solidarity with these comrades for pointing out that hypocrisy and organizing people to act on it.
The worst is when you're in a right to work state and an at-will employment state, which you and I both are, Eddie. At-will employment is really insidious. It basically means that they can fire you no matter what. They don't need a reason. They don't need anything. They don't need cause. No contracts. You're just gone, which is wild to me. I had something else to say, but that's okay.
But
what if people are bad at their job?
I was going to say that, that's one of the people that are in favor of the existing order. They love talking about Adam Smith as the ideological forefather. But I mean, I don't think any of them have actually taken the time to read The Wealth of Nations, because he's extremely in favor of worker combinations. He's super critical of the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie, who he sees constantly collaborating with each other and with the government to not just influence the market, but to influence government regulations in their favor, and then say that, it's against the free market for workers to get together and to organize for their own interests. So not only does he rail against, the landlords, but he also rails against the hypocrisy of the capitalists, the influence that they have on the government. And really his main concern with influencing the free markets was not the government doing so in the interest of the people. On the contrary, there's a whole section dedicated in the Wealth of Nations to how the government should serve the people and the public good and the various ways in which it should intervene. His main concern was the ways that capitalists get together and influence the market to have a better result for them, which is a natural tendency in capital. Capitalist competition turns into monopoly capital eventually. So that's something that I wanted to mention. But I mean, this is really a quite historic victory, and I'm really glad that we were able to get to it first, because I think in terms of importance for our workers' movement here in the U.S., it's just tremendous. And it's I had sent the Twitter page from the Michigan Communist Party Club, because if you look at the quote tweet replies to it, it's just so incredibly hilarious. It's a bunch of Republicans who have no idea what the right to work bill, what right to work actually means, and they're basically treating it as communists are supporting a bill that would repeal the ability for people to work. So they're playing on the stereotype of communists are just lazy people who do not want to work and they don't want to have the right to work. And I mean, if there's anything that shows the epitome of bourgeois stupidity, it's it's that. But so it's extremely important because, as you said, Eddie, I think most of us, uh, didn't know until we were involved in socialist politics what right to work actually meant. And they do this on purpose. They use these names that sound very good, just like flexibility and all these.
Patriot Act.
Right. Independent contractor. They use
Mhm.
all of these nice names in order to put a nice whitewashed veneer on top of the fact that they're just screwing you.
That's all it ever is. It's maybe it's sort of like depends on where you live, but where I'm from, I grew up with just every day you go down the highway, there's billboards saying right to work is a lie. And it's like, the labor is local or the Teamsters or whoever, they alternate buying these billboards. The crazy thing is we still have that here. So yeah, I'm really, really happy for all of our brothers and sisters in Michigan.
Yeah, and this is the kind of reform that I think we should struggle for. Like this is a good place to put energy. Like people sometimes criticize us because they know that we're really critical of the Democratic Party. They'll say, well, how do we get reforms then, right? How do we fight to make people's lives better as much as we can within this capitalist system that we live in? It's like, this is how organizing real workers' combinations, real grassroots forms of struggle to try and get common sense policies that make every worker's life life better. That's where we can put our energy in doing so, reveal the hypocrisy of the capitalist ruling class as they did, and get real gains, real things that affect workers' lives, which, the Democratic Party is not putting their efforts there. They're never serious about fighting for the things that they claim to fight for. So
No, they never, ever, ever have our backs in these things. And what it does, as well as giving working class people a better life, it puts us in a better tactical place than we were beforehand. Now, all of these workers that would not have been in the unions are now getting organized. And that's important, especially in this period of the sort of rebuilding of the real progressive forces in America. I don't think like that this is happening now is not a coincidence.
for sure. Anything else to add, either of you, on the Michigan situation? Get out and form a CPUSA chapter in your area and do something like this.
We're hoping to get in contact with one of the workers that was leading the union in this effort. So we might have an interview in the next couple of weeks with someone who was in the front lines of this struggle, explaining to us what was going on, the stuff that led to it, and how it won. Because I know that it was a Democratic administration, a Democratic Party administration, which passed it. So I'm pretty sure that people are going to use that to spin the narrative that, look, the Democrats are pro-worker, but they gotta, not just see the fact, but see the factors that led to the fact, and it's the amount of worker struggles that forced them into that position, and it could have well been a Republican in a different area that is against right to work that could have done it. So it was, at the end of the day, workers coming together and fighting, not the voting for the Democratic Party that did it.
Absolutely. So, moving on to our next segment, then, I suppose. First, I want to start by asking, well, I'm doing this first because someone in the chat asked if I had ever done a video on the Iraq War. And while I've done plenty of TikToks on it and stuff, I realized I'd never done like a deep dive going into like a Marxist analysis of the Iraq War. And there's probably a lot of youngsters in our audience who were born maybe even after 2003, or who don't really remember the Bush administration and the Iraq War. So, first of all, I want to ask, especially Noah, I guess, because you're a little bit older than Carlos and I. Do you remember the war? Do you remember the propaganda surrounding it? Do you remember the post 9/11 anti-Muslim fervor? And what do you remember from that time?
Dude, it was great. It was a really horrible, dark time in this country's history. The propaganda really is what sort of sprang to the front of my mind when you mentioned that. And I remember being in a card shop when I was younger. I was like 19, I think, when 9/11 happened. So right after that, a year after that, and there were trading cards of American like generals and officers being sold, and like a real picture on one side, and then like an artistic rendition of them like strangling an Iraqi soldier. Right? There was one I remember that there was like a big cardboard cutout of, and it was Norman Schwarzkopf, who was at the time commanding. He was a general commanding all of the American forces in this invasion, and it had him on the front, just like standing, and then the next one on the other side was him holding a gun like this, standing on like a pile of smoking ruins and skeletons. It's the image is like burned in my mind. But between 9/11 and the Iraq War, there was so much just anti-Islamic fervor, anti anything brown was called Muslim and attacked. There was a Lebanese family that owned the grocery store 2 blocks from my house, and like every window was busted out. The store was looted a couple times, and these people have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia or terrorists or anything. It was a really, really dark time.
How about you, Carlos? You got any personal stories or anything you remember from it?
I don't. I was too young. We had just got here from Cuba, and it happened. I think the year after it happened the year after we got here from Cuba. But I mean, we've been in Miami, so we have been most of our life in a community that only as of recently has begun to be diversified. So it's just a bunch of Cubans of all colors, and I grew up without seeing that much hate crime. But the propaganda was quite rampant, of course. And what I remember from that time, maybe a little bit after, was like a Lupe Fiasco song about 9/11, and I started to see some of the conspiracy theories that started developing out of that. And I've talked to Ramiro before about this. He mentioned that, for a lot of people, those conspiracy theories were like segues into like an accurate understanding of like the imperialist nature of the war, of the propaganda. But I think still today, we're seeing a lot of similar, maybe not to the same extent, but similar forms of dehumanizing propaganda with the Russians. And I think that one of the things that we can extrapolate, the sort of general characteristic, is that whoever becomes an enemy of, U.S. Euro-American finance capital and imperialism ends up being, not just attacked for their own right, but also dehumanized. And racist dehumanization has always been a fundamental role of otherizing the people who were labeling the enemy in the interest of capital, and in convincing the populace of the country that's waging the war to go along with the drumming war drums. So
Absolutely. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was part of this broader war on terror that was essentially just anti-Muslim rhetoric and propaganda used to justify imperialist warfare, obviously on behalf of finance capital. And something had to replace the Cold War. That was what it was for years. It's us versus communism. It's us versus the Soviets. Well, there's no more Soviet Union, and NATO, was formed to supposedly prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union. And yet, you have the NATO carpet bombing of Serbia and the destruction of that country at the end of the 90s. And then in 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, 2003, the invasion of Iraq. So the U.S. needed some way to justify their continued warfare other than just anti-communism. And it just became there's too many extremists in the Middle East, in this region. Ignore the fact, don't talk about the fact that, we've been supporting and funding and arming those extremists when it suits our interests for the last 20 years. But we just got to go and fight them and take them all out. And I remember, like, as a kid, it's interesting talking about the you guys remember it from your personal experience with the war. But I remember as a kid spending so much time thinking about religion, and I was raised in a religious household, and I would just think, how is their religion so violent? How does their religion push people to kill other people? That just doesn't make any sense to me. And as I began to find the truth and the material factors behind the war and their country devolving into civil war, and find that it was the U.S. backing these extremist groups. It was the U.S. who tried to set up a government based on identity and based on religion and based on ethnicity, when the Iraqis had never done anything like that before. They had always been a secular government until the U.S. came and tried to set up this government based on identity, threw the country into chaos, and then you have the emergence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Wait, Eddie,
material factors. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Eddie, no, are you trying to tell me it's not because they hate our freedom? I could have sworn the president told us that back in the day.
But they had weapons of mass destruction.
Put that picture back up. It reminds me of. Do you ever see the Chappelle Show Black Bush sketches?
Oh no, I haven't.
Oh, they're so good. And Mos Def plays the black CIA guy, and then the old man, he's this other guy, and he's like, they got yellow cake, and he's holding a piece of cake. It's so good.
What's funny is that it just looks like Coke.
Mm.
It just looks like he's got a little thing of Coke. It's like, what are you doing with that in there? Wild.
The weapons of mass destruction thing is interesting to me. What is also interesting is it coming on the heels of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? It is always, always, always about the establishment's need to, one, overcome the falling rate of profit, and two, find avenues of speculation because of this. And it's always going to be sort of the corporations driving this, and the domination of the U.S. after the fall of the Soviet Union was their chance to sort of try to bandage the crises that capitalism creates, right? Without the Soviet Union there, in order to promote all of this speculation and buying of, billion-dollar jets and nukes, etc., and building up, it would fall apart. That's what all of the violence in the Middle East has been about the entire time. And they play on the sort of white chauvinism of our history in order to further that goal. And like Carlos was saying, otherize people. And I mentioned earlier that it was anything brown, and it really, really was. I had Mexican friends who were mistaken for Muslims and harassed. You know, it's crazy. It's just, it's always capitalism, right?
Yeah, and by
Oh,
the
just real quick, our friend Alan Freeman says it's capitalism, stupid, all the time, right? And that's it.
And the beauty or the evil of using religion as your scapegoat and saying it's just that, you know, the Muslim religion is so inherently violent that's why all this fighting is going on, is that conceals the real truth. You know, it conceals the relations of production. If you can look into the religion of Islam as long as you want, trust me, I have, you're never going to be able to find something that, you know, justifies something like ISIS. You know, you have to look at the material factors, which when you understand those, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. You know, they had a secular government that was just completely overthrown, and the U.S. brought back a bunch of Iraqi exiles to try and run the government. And there was a power vacuum that was created. But I want to jump into talking about the Gulf War a little bit, because Noah, you mentioned the long history of destabilizing Iraq. And yeah, this didn't start, the Iraq War didn't start, as is the case with most U.S. imperialist projects. It didn't start with the invasion. It didn't start in 2003. Oftentimes the Gulf War is like glossed over in history classes, but George Bush's father in 1990 was the first American president to attack Iraq. So Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, partly over an oil dispute, partly over wanting some revenge from the Iraq-Iran war.
He got American permission for that too. They didn't step foot in Kuwait without asking America first.
I didn't even have that written down in my facts, but that is incredible too. So they gave him permission to invade Kuwait, and then because of using the Carter Doctrine, which says that the U.S. is obligated to protect Saudi Arabia, they took fake satellite images, showed them to the Saudi monarchs, the Saudi king, and got the go-ahead to start bombing Iraq. Said, look, Iraqi troops are at your border. We have these satellite images, which were fake, and used the Iraq invasion of Kuwait that they gave Iraq the thumbs up to do to begin attacking Iraq. And if you see, I pulled up a map here. We're a little zoomed out, but here's Saudi Arabia, here's Kuwait, and here's Iraq. So Iraq went into Kuwait. The U.S. said we need to defend Saudi Arabia, even though Iraq had no intention of going into Saudi Arabia. And there you go. That was all the justification that they needed to start bombing Iraq, which they did, killing 200,000 people, according to Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, which he got the statistics from some global organization that counts things like that. 200,000 people were killed. The bombings destroyed the Iraqi infrastructure, and then the sanctions that followed the bombings were the worst part. That's where over 500,000 children, not just people, but 500,000 children were killed by starvation and disease as a direct result of the sanctions. And as Noah said, when these bombings were kicking off, Saddam Hussein was literally wondering, what's going on? Where's the Soviet Union? Why is it being allowed to happen? And it's because in 1990, the Soviet Union was already in the process of dissolving. So they could no longer provide this umbrella of protection over the developing world through the UN Security Council the way that they had for years. So, you know, and we talk about also the disaster that the collapse of the Soviet Union was for the world. This is what we mean. A report from the UN said that Iraq, after these sanctions and bombings, were in a pre-industrial state that was near apocalyptic. So Iraq was turned from a secular government, developing country into a pre-industrial state where people were starving, and 500,000 children were killed by U.S. sanctions. So this also, the beginning of the Gulf War and the sanctions on Iraq that happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I like to conceptualize this as a qualitative shift in U.S. foreign policy, and a qualitative shift in the stance of Western imperialism from the Cold War to the war on terror, quote unquote, which was used to justify the intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, so much more. It can all kind of be lumped together, but the Soviet Union collapsed, so the Cold War was over, so there needed to be a new way to convince Americans why we should perpetually be at war, especially with the Middle East where there's all this oil. So 9/11 gave them, a perfect propaganda tool as well, but it was happening before that, right? It was in 1990 when this qualitative shift happened, not in 2003.
And not only that, it keeps us distracted and gives us something to hate that isn't our own ruling class, just like they give us each other to hate right now in the working class. What I find really, really fascinating about the Iraq War and Saddam Hussein as a historical figure in particular is he was America's boy for a long time. He worked with the CIA. They funded him. They sort of encouraged him to, and they were fine with him killing the entire left wing of the Ba'athist Party in his country, including his cousin. Was it Sadiq, I think, or Qasim, maybe? But either one. And they were fine with all of this. They were fine with crackdowns, whatever he needed to do to consolidate power from the opposition. They backed. It was not until he wanted to increase Iraq's share of international oil markets, right, in order to build up infrastructure in Iraq and not give all of this capital to the super majors or the finance cartels, that they had a problem, right? That was when the problem began. And it was downhill from there. And then the slant drilling thing and all that.
And I think that one of the saddest things is that people have still not learned, because they're still holding on to, what Eddie calls hindsight, anti-imperialism. Like they're able to oppose wars 10, 15, 20 years down the line, but when similar dynamics are at play right in front of them, and all the lapdog media of the ruling class is shouting at you, telling you that if you don't accept our opinion, you're a Putinist, and Putin is Hitler, so basically you're a Nazi. When that's going on in front of them, all the lessons, yeah, Putler, all the lessons that they supposedly learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, take your pick, it all goes out the window. And the if you follow these events and how they unfold, they take a similar trajectory. They're planned way ahead of time. I put a video in the private chat. I don't know if you want to pull it up, but it's General Wesley Clark talking about how, a few years ahead of time, they had a list of 7 countries that they had to invade. He's I believe a CIA official or something, and he goes back. He had retired, and he goes back, and they tell him, now we're going into Iraq, and then we're going into Iran, and then then we're going here, and then we're going there. And if you really track the trajectory of the countries, it's the ones that had the most oil. So there's an economic logic behind all of this, but you can't understand that properly unless you have the Marxist outlook. And I've been recently getting a lot into Lukács's work on irrationalism as the route that bourgeois philosophy has to take, because if it treats reason with any respect and tries to approach the world rationally and understand it, it's forced to come to terms with the world through a dialectical materialist worldview, and therefore to come to conclusions which align it with the Marxist. But it's more committed to the existing order than to truth, and therefore it has to land itself in some form of irrationalism. And I think you look at the discourse of all these people, whether it's around Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, or now in the proxy war against Russia, and the sort of same irrationalism appears over and over and over again. You can't tell me that, the newspapers Yeah, we're talking about the Nazi problem in Ukraine, 8 years ago, and who are still putting pictures with peoples with swastikas. You can't tell me that them saying there's no fascist or Nazi problem in Ukraine is not an act of utter irrationalism. And the same thing took place in all of these different wars.
Yeah, and a perfect transition from that is after the Gulf War, and after we knew that the U.S. had bombed Iraq to a pre-industrial state, caused 500 million children to starve or die of disease, and this war had been justified by the fake satellite photos that we talked about, as well as a fake testimony that's now famous called the Naira testimony, where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador said that the Iraqi troops were taking babies out of incubators and leaving them on the floor to die. Well, in fact, they found out this was atrocity propaganda to justify the war, but by then it was too late, and Iraq was already in this pre-industrial, near-apocalyptic state. So after that, on 60 Minutes in 1996, I believe, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked, 500 million children died from this. Would you say that's worth it? And you can see your answer for yourself.
It's muted, Eddie.
Also, to correct the number, it's 500,000.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So there you heard it straight from her mouth. You want to talk about forcing yourself to end up in a place of irrationalism. You're literally presented with the statistic. You killed 500 million children based on a bunch of lies. And she says straight up, we think it was worth it.
That's such a softball question too. Like, if it was presented in a game show, it'd be like one of the first ones that are, for $5, is it worth killing 500,000 children? It's a very clear no in every. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It's a very clear no. I don't like using the word evil, because it connotes very, religious underpinnings that, I personally don't have. But I don't know what else to call these people other than evil. They're the personifications of the greatest evil that has killed, more people in humanity than I can count. So it's disgusting.
What's really tragic about the whole thing is that they've never been held accountable for this, right? They lap their way to the bank. They're all, millionaires and billionaires. And it's disgusting. And it's going to take regular people standing up, getting organized and fighting back in a real way to hold them accountable for these kind of things. On a somewhat lighter note, Michael Parenti has a very funny joke about the Naria. Is it Naria or Naraya? Or I always said
Naira,
Naria.
I think.
Naira? I always said Naria in my head because I'm stupid. But dumb American, right? I can't pronounce anything and not in English. But he said that like they must have been the world's biggest incubator place in the world. Just premature babies, just every single birth in all of Iraq for that to actually make sense.
It's so absurd sometimes, the propaganda. It's like the stuff you hear about North Korea, like Yeonmi Park. Oh, yeah, at the hospitals, they eat rats, and then the rats eat people, and then the people eat the rats. It's just a cycle. Like, how many rats are in this hospital? Like, that doesn't even make sense.
It's crazy to me that people like think they actually believe these things. They can suspend their disbelief to this wild world where reality is actually a cartoon, where, Kim Jong-un is feeding people to piranhas, like just crazy, insane things that if you think about it for 2 seconds, you're like, that's stupid. Like if you made a movie about that, I would say that's stupid to unrealistic. Don't do it,
Right. I want to say too, Noah, you were mentioning how these people have never been held accountable and they laughed their way to the bank. That reminds me of something else Parenti says, that George Bush was not dumb, right? His evils were not like an accident. It wasn't just idiocy, right? He knew what he was doing, and he was, he was portraying himself like an actor, as this hokey guy from Texas, from the South, who doesn't realize that he's massacring people on behalf of finance capital in the military industrial complex. He absolutely knew, right? He absolutely knew what he was doing. And he's a cold, calculating neoconservative. And a lot of the people, if you don't think he knew, like, look at his family history. And his dad's administration was Colin Powell when they were doing the Gulf War. Then Colin Powell would go on to be in the Bush administration and be the one who would lie about the WMDs. Or he wasn't, sorry, he was Joint Chief of Staff, so one of the military leaders, not in the administration. But him, George Bush the elder and George Bush the senior, George Bush the younger, had the same people in their administration. They both killed millions in the same country, right? So he knew exactly what he was doing. He was following in his father and his grandfather's footsteps, as we'll talk about a little bit later too. And Madeleine Albright, when she died, was lauded as this courageous woman. I have a bunch of the things that people said about her written down. Anthony Blinken said who's now our current Secretary of State, right? Is that his exact position? Pretty much the person crafting Biden's foreign policy and policy in Ukraine. He said about Madeleine Albright, this lady who said killing 500,000 people was worth it. She was a brilliant diplomat, a visionary leader, a courageous trailblazer, a dedicated mentor, and a great and good person who loved the United States. And Joe Biden said hers were the hands that turned the tide of history, which is definitely true for the 500,000 people she killed. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said she was saddened to hear of the news of Madeleine Albright's death. She was a force for freedom and an outspoken champion of #NATO, an inspirational colleague and friend. My deepest condolences to her family and the American people. Jens Stoltenberg makes no mention of the Iraqi people, probably because Madeleine Albright killed 500,000 of them, not million. Over a million.
Not to mention the American working people they stole from to kill those people.
Yes, and sent to fight and die, and
right. They basically used us as bullets.
Right. The last quote I have was Progressive Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who said she was devastated to hear of the passing of Albright. As a war survivor, she demonstrated remarkable empathy for those facing violence and inhumanity throughout her career. So it's progressives, it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's all these folks in the State Department and the White House and these arms of the financial oligarchy who are praising Madeleine Albright, this arch neoconservative. So this reminds me of the George Carlin quote, "It's a big club and you ain't in it." That's all it comes down to. Those big houses that we saw flying over Washington, D.C., that's where the big club hangs out, and we're not in it.
And that's such a basic thing to figure out. I feel like that's already figured out by the vast majority of Americans. If you look at the polls in terms of dissatisfaction with representatives, only around 20% of the people feel like their representatives are representing them. And if you look at the polls of the amount of people that disagree with both parties and would want an alternative third party, it's like 60 something, almost 70%. So the vast majority of people know this. They know very clearly that the two parties don't represent them, that they represent a class that they're clearly not in, that it's a big club and they're not in it, as you correctly referenced, Carlin saying. And, what's very tough is that very basic level of understanding is not shared by people who should share it, because they call them people who call themselves Marxists or Marxist-Leninists and communists, who would still, say that, yeah, but this one side of the club is more fun or is less evil, and therefore we should continue voting and canvassing and fighting to have this one side of the club elected as opposed to the other one. So it's, in a certain sense, the organizations which are supposed to function as the highest expression of social consciousness are behind the consciousness of the American people, who already are very much anti-establishment.
Absolutely. So we haven't even talked about the Iraq War. Yeah, we've just made it through the Gulf War, but I mean, it's important to understand that because everything has its roots in history, right? Everything has a historical development. Nothing just showed up here. And when you're talking about the Iraq War, which was perpetrated or led up by George W. Bush, and his father literally started a war against Iraq 10 years ago, you need to understand the one to understand the other. But if we want to go even further back, Prescott Bush was the father of George H.W. Bush, who did the Gulf War, and the grandfather of George W. Bush, who did the Iraq War. And he was a finance capitalist, politician, and weapons contractor in the 20th century, or throughout the early and mid 20th century. Really one of the original architects of the military industrial complex, one of the original, people who jumped around between political office, banking, the head of weapons contractors, the head of a steel company, and really was an archetype of that revolving door. Lenin talks about how at the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th, that's when the qualitative change happens and capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism, dominated by finance capitalists and banks, which is capitalism in its imperialist stage. And that's when capitalism needs to go abroad and super exploit other countries. And in America, Prescott Bush was one of the finance capitalists leading this up. He was born in 1890, I believe, so born right before the qualitative shift to the stage of imperialism happens. And imperialism helped build the Bush family fortune. And Dwight Eisenhower was warning us about the military-industrial complex before he left office in the 1960s. And that was, or the early 1960s, and that was, right when Prescott Bush was at his peak, at his prominence. The other way that he made his fortune was through allying with Nazi Germany. I swear to God, he was one of the financial architects of Hitler's rise to power, and the Nazis who would attempt to take over the world. So really think about that, and the fact that, thank you, Carlos. Think about that and the fact that two of his offspring, or two of his heredity, then rose to the highest office in America and immediately attacked other countries and tried to maintain dominance over the whole world. So he continued funding, or Prescott continued funding Hitler's rise to power even well after Americans knew about the concentration camps and the massacres. And the money he made in Germany helped kick off the Bush family fortune, like I said, which absolutely that generational wealth played a vital role in allowing George H.W. and George W. to become president. And then these freaking oligarchs had the nerve, the gall, to try and give us Jeb Bush in 2016. They're like, this guy's even stupider than the rest of them, but you'll probably take him, you dumb Americans. And Donald Trump busted up that plan for the neoconservatives that year. But yeah, Bush family legacy.
I wonder how the American people would feel if they knew these things. That, this is a Nazi family. They got to start allying with the Nazis. Was Prescott Bush one of the people involved in the attempt at a fascist coup here, or am I wrong about that?
I don't know if he was. I mean, it's hard to say because there was so much concentration, so much connection between the shareholders. Like,
right.
I'm sure we don't know everyone involved, but I didn't see that he wasn't like one of the direct ones or one of the ones who was caught.
It strikes me as amazing that, especially after World War II, people could be okay with this literal, like the family that became their oppressor through allying with the Nazis, that so many Americans heroically sacrifice themselves to defeat. It's wild, man.
Absolutely. I think I feel like George Bush, I mean, Prescott Bush is definitely was one of the architects of the military industrial complex, which was emerging in the 60s. I feel like you can look at George W. Bush as a complete capture of the government, not just by finance capital, but by the military industrial complex themselves.
And the sort of deep state too.
Right. Yes, the deep state's another good way to put it. Like him and his father and Prescott Bush were all part of Yale and the Skull and Bone Society and all this weird stuff.
Well, not to mention the CIA, you know?
Right. Which is just, stuff that stems from a total concentration of power to the point where there's like this wealthy club of people who think that they literally run the world, which is how we get these political dynasties like the Clintons and the Bushes. But I mean, the fact that his father and his grandfather were who we were, and then the fact that he immediately appointed Dick Cheney, who is literally the chairman of Halliburton, like literally the chairman of a weapons contractor. So, between the 60s when Eisenhower was warning us about the formation of the military industrial complex, which was headed up, like I said, by Prescott Bush, then you have Prescott Bush's heredity 40 years later, claiming the government, actually taking power of the government, saying, guess who runs the government now? The chairman of Halliburton. Let's go invade Iraq.
It's when people these days, like, they don't really talk about the Bush era much. And I think it's an area of history that really, really needs talked about more because it directly builds where we're at today. But a lot of people, they when they sort of become aware of society being broken, they look at Trump as this anti-establishment guy. And he has the exact same kind of appointments that both Bushes did, though. Just like Dick Cheney was appointed, Rex Tillerson, right? The CEO of Exxon was appointed his Secretary of State, right? That's insane. That's not an anti-establishment guy. That is someone very much in with the establishment, trying to appear anti-establishment because it's hip now.
And if you're talking about clubs in the sense of like where they're participating in their social life, they're all in the same clubs. Like the social circles that they all hang out with are the same. There's a million and one photos of all these people together and, pictures of them with Epstein. So it's, to have one of the big hitters from those clubs present themselves as an anti-establishment figure, I don't know if there's any clearer case of how successful the ruling class is in presenting establishment discourse as anti-establishment or establishment movements as anti-establishment.
Absolutely. I think the Bush administration is understudied, like you said, Noah, both Bush administrations, because and not like we kind of take it for granted. Like if the Iraq war was a sham, like most people do, and a lot of people who were around for the era of George Bush, kind of by the time he left office in 2008, it was almost like he was a laughingstock. But his image has been rehabilitated by, liberal media and Republican media. And there are a lot of young people getting into politics now who never experienced George Bush, don't know who George Bush is. Like when I look at, it's crazy how fast time goes by is what I was trying to say. And, how many new people can vote every year who were like born in 2003 or 2004. It seems crazy. Like, how is that possible? But it is, that's how time works, I guess. But there are a lot of people who don't know about George Bush. And like you said, there are people who are still around in the State Department and in the government from the Bush administration. Elliot Abrams is one. John Bolton is another who was appointed by Trump. Like you said, people were portraying Trump as an anti-imperialist, especially now, that he's out of office. It's easier to kind of try and rewrite everybody's memory because the things that Trump did are less fresh in our minds. But today, when I was researching this, I was like, Trump had John Bolton as his national security advisor or whatever. Like that is the most bloodthirsty, blatantly pro-war neocon who's ever walked this earth.
Yeah.
To try and call him anti-imperialist when he appointed John Bolton is hilarious.
Well, like Bolton especially Like, he admitted to organizing coups, and he was like, "This isn't a coup. Like, I've organized coups. They're a lot harder to do, right? Like, just that you brag about being able to." Anyway, but like, so the typical Trump fan rhetoric is, well, Bolton was forced on him. Okay, let's say that's true. That's possible, right? Kamala Harris was forced on Biden, but he also appointed Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams is just a sleazier version of Bolton, or a younger version, just as sleazy as Bolton.
Probably one of Bolton's mentors, if I had to guess, someone who probably learned from Kissinger and kind of took up the torch, and one of the architects of the Iraq War, one of the architects of current Venezuela policy and the sanctions. Like, that we're talking about, these are literally people who sit around all day thinking, like, how can we make these sanctions as vicious as possible to cut off as vital of industries as we can, and to cut off medicine and things that people need so we can starve them out and turn them against their government. Like,
And
they're fucking psychopaths. I'm sorry. I just have
they're
to
evil. Carlos has the right word. They're
psychopaths.
And because he's like anti-Trump in his book, he's like a regular at MSNBC now.
Right. Literally. As is Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
The idea that Trump is a singular figure, all it does is takes people and puts them in a fake sort of struggle, right? Like, the Democrats and Republicans is not a real struggle, guys. They're all, like Carlos was just saying, they're all in the same club. They went to the same private schools, right? They get taught to lead, right? They get taught to rule. We get taught to work.
And it's important to notice the hypocrisy in the discourse, because the U.S. champions internationally the rules-based international order. And you have people who can literally go on, the biggest media in the country, admit that they've done coups before, brag about the difficulty of the coups that they've done, and then just nothing happens to them, right? You have these war criminals just walking around, nothing happens to them. They're not subject to U.S. law. They're not subject, to punishment by international law, which is binding in the U.S., and it's extreme. Rules-based international order ends up just meaning whatever the hell is in the interest of American monopoly capital and finance capital.
And
Absolutely.
they're not going to be held accountable for this until we do it. Organizing right now is absolutely mandatory. Now is the time. Everyone knows this stuff these days. People are becoming more and more aware. Reproletarianization is happening. All we need to do is get over our own shit, really. Right? I'm sorry to keep swearing, by the way, brothers. But we need to get over ourselves and actually create something concrete and kick these people out of power. We can do it. Half of the entire sort of propaganda apparatus is designed just to make us think we can't, right? But we absolutely can. They are people just like us. They have names, they have faces, they live in houses, they, drop deuces in the toilet. Like, it's the same. The only difference is they're in power and we're not yet because they're more organized.
I thought they go potty outside.
Did you see potty? You've been around the baby a lot, huh?
I saw a sign today on some asshole's lawn, which was it was a picture of a dog pooping, and then it had the line like "no." And I was like, well, everything else is fair game then, I wonder if you could drop a deuce here, and as long as it's not a dog, it's fair game, and they're not mad.
Like that old SNL sketch where was it Daryl Hammond was like playing a dog and Will Ferrell's yelling at him from the kitchen.
They'll have to get like every time a new being poops on their lawn, they'll have to get a new sign along next to the dog one or not, and then they'll have like a picture of a human there.
Reminds me as a kid, we'd go hiking and you'd see the no dumping signs and we'd just giggle our heads off at it.
Hilarious. There was a a hiking thing or a trail they'd always take us to called Stanky Basin. And it said no dumping at Stanky Basin, and the fourth graders thought that was hilarious. That was when the stanky leg.
And I think that's hilarious.
That was when the stanky leg came out too. So we'd be like, hit the Stanky Basin, and then we would do the dance. We're pretty funny in fourth grade. Thank you for the super sticker, Stephen Michael Palazzo. I appreciate that. We're almost now as rich as George Bush, who was teaching a $15 a month master class in case you want to learn how to be leadership skills and painting skills from President George W. Bush, as if you haven't given him enough of your money and resources.
Yo, for an evil sort of like psycho like he is, his painting skills are actually like on point. He's always been
weirdly good.
Yeah, when I lived in LA, I dated this girl who her best friend growing up was Barbara, George W. Bush's daughter. So she was like over at the Bush house on weekends for dinners and whatnot.
Wow.
Like in the house of a mass murderer. I asked her about that, and she was like, he was weird. I mean, he'd be normal, and then he'd get real quiet and just leave the room. And
I feel like
expect from something like that, you know? Most of the time, he's just like on the treadmill drinking a beer, and then he'll just he's got to be away from people.
It would be so interesting to know what he's like personally, because when I look at the paintings, I see like, I'm like, is George Bush just like a tortured man who was born into this finance capitalist imperialist family and he didn't want to, but he's kind of charismatic, so he's just like, you got to do it, George, and I don't want to run the country. All right, well, appoint Dick Cheney then. This guy, runs shit for Halliburton. Have him be your vice president. He'll run shit. You can just paint. Like, okay. Fool me one time, shame on you.
When he was young, he was like all wild. He got caught doing coke a bunch, and he's an alcoholic. He's just like a good old boy in Texas, but the good type of good old boy that burned the crosses back in the day. The rich kind that doesn't want those types around him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to not want to like dive into the personalities of these people, but the more you spend time in studying politics and studying economics, the more you realize that these are just people. They seem like insurmountable giants, but like you said, they put their pants on in the morning just like you. They take dumps just like you. And it's like, what kind of person would do this, would end up in this position? It's often people, like you said, who go to Yale, who are literally trained for this. They have these weird secret societies like the Skull and Bones Society, where they learn, probably where they talk about, how they're the inheritors of ruling the world or whatever weird shit that they believe. But then they literally, run the State Department and run the most powerful bodies in global capitalism. And they're mass murderers who run around and get away scot-free. And I mean, to even make the point more about George Bush being like a tortured soul, he recently admitted that Iraq was an illegal and brutal intervention when he was trying to talk about Russia's military operation in Ukraine, and accidentally let the truth come out and said, that the invasion of Iraq was brutal and illegal. And said, I mean, Ukraine. And I goes, well, Iraq too. I'm 75. He was saying like, I'm 75, and everyone laughed at that. Like, oh yeah, he's losing his marbles. But I think he was also saying like, I'm 75. I'll admit it. I don't give a shit anymore. Like
now that it can't hurt him, that it can't hurt upset their plans. It's fine because his focus is on,
Ukraine,
Russia and Ukraine, and funding the Nazis in Ukraine.
Yes.
I think
everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight, even George Bush himself.
Precisely. There's a quote for you, brother. But it's Chris Hedges. Speaking of the Iraq War, he was talking about that a while after it, not too long after it, and he was talking about how these ruling class people, he actually grew up with them, And he had the interesting perspective of being a working class person who came from a poor family that got scholarships and grants to all these like elite schools, right? And he said that they don't treat people like people. Unless you're in their club, you are less than human to them. He remembered, he told a story when he wouldn't say who it was, but it was people in the Senate that were literally like chewing up pieces of gum and throwing them into a maid's hair. That's the kind of people that run our country. And I hate to get it back to organizing. Like, are we going to let that stand? For real? Are we going to let that stand?
Especially at a time when I don't think the American people have been as conscious of this ever before, and the potential that we have now. We had tremendous potential during the Reconstruction period, right before the counter-revolution of property in 1876. Tremendous potential, but nowhere near what we have now. Today, that force of racism, which was just completely impossible to get over at the time in the Reconstruction era, it's not as bad anymore. And in many places of the country has basically become obsolete, and the opposite is true. You have a problem of over excessive white guilt, as opposed to there's forms of racism that you had in the past. So I think that I teach in the poorest town in all of Illinois. Most of my students come from working class families, black, Hispanic, white, and the vast majority of them, understand these things, or at least are open enough to accepting them. And I've never seen that before, and I've been organizing for around 10 years, and it's just been progressively getting easier to convince people over to socialism. And it's a real shame when you look around and you see excuse me, I have a gang of chihuahuas in the background. When you see that there's institutions that have resources and power and could be doing a whole lot more to get to the people, just not doing it, and falling into the party politics and team politics that we have in the U.S. But I wanted to mention that tomorrow we have an event that Midwestern Marx endorsed, which is the answer
Oh,
against the
Carlos, you're cutting out, brother.
against the proxy. Oh, am I back?
Yeah,
You're good. You're good. Go ahead.
Tomorrow you have the protest against the war machine and against the proxy war against Russia, amongst a few other things that they have listed. But they've gotten a bunch of endorsements from a series of different organizations, our institute included, and they're going to be doing it not just in Washington but in a few other areas. If you want more information, we'll link the Answer Coalition webpage that's tied to this protest into the chat, and it's done on the day of the anniversary of the protest against the war in Iraq by Answer Coalition, who was also quite active at the time in protesting against that war. Fighting for peace in this moment is as important as ever. We are, our ruling class, at least not we, our ruling class is tiptoeing us into the precipice of a nuclear Armageddon. And it's very scary. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the clock that tells us how close we are to midnight it keeps consistently staying at a number that's the lowest it's ever been, and that's absolutely terrifying. And I'm sorry, but that's the most important issue that we have right now. There's other things that might be important, but the analysis of principal and secondary contradiction has to apply here, and potential nuclear Armageddon is by far the most important thing, which means fighting for peace is extremely important, and uniting with other people, regardless of their ideological background, in order to fight for peace is very important. And that's why we supported the efforts of the February 19 protests, even though we disagreed with a wide variety of the people there. There was other people there that spoke that like Jill Stein. I voted for her in 2016, and other people who had more ideological coherence with the ideology of our institute. But this protest, of course, is led by people probably more ideologically in line with us. But it's still, don't make that a barrier for entrance. If someone's organizing an anti-war protest, get there, talk to people, because nothing could be more important than fighting for peace right now.
Yeah, and shout out to all the organizers behind those protests. As an educational institute, we'd love to support and endorse, and being as involved as we can with all of that stuff, which is why we've endorsed both of these, and why we try and put our money where our mouth is when it comes to forming, a broad anti-imperialist coalition, despite maybe some differences, theoretical or political differences here and there. The main thing we're attacking right now is imperialism, even if that means allying with some libertarians, so be it. That doesn't mean we're going to let them into our organization. That doesn't mean they're going to be joining Midwestern Marx or CPUSA anytime ever. But, we can work together on these events. And I mean, the fact that these coalitions are forming and that these protests are forming speaks to what Carlos was saying earlier, that, the conditions for a revolution or an anti-imperialist uprising, socialist uprising are there, right? Like that energy for it is, it's there. We just need a serious organization that we can send serious people to, like I know maybe some people don't like that I would criticize this, but look at the 2019 DSA convention, right? Like DSA got really big, really popular. A lot of people joined DSA, but it was not a serious organization, right? Serious people who want to address the serious problems facing our country as a whole, these things that people recognize are legitimate crises that could devolve into nuclear war. They are turned away by like what they saw at DSA, which is basically a bunch of college students being hypersensitive, right? We need a serious party that understands the serious problems that we face and the path to changing them and fixing them. And I think that CPUSA can become that party, which is why I'm a member of CPUSA. I think that it can, through a process of becoming and through a process of development, becoming forged and hardened by struggle, it can become a serious party for serious people.
100%, brother. I have no doubt that we can be an integral part of the process of building this party into what it needs to be to lead the American people into the next thing. The people are ready, as we've just been talking about, as we see, and the conditions could not be more necessary for this. And the conditions, that nuclear Armageddon clock, for example, are what create the sort of hardening of a force like we're speaking of in the first place, right? The people are there. The people need this organization. All that is holding us back is ourselves at this point. The enemy of the left, and it's always been the case, has been the left, right? And we sort of try to live the criticism of the purity fetish, right? Carlos has a book on this coming out in a couple of days that I had the honor of editing. And I really think this book is giant. It's gigantic. It can change things if we read it, if we take the idea seriously, and if we apply it in our organizing, in our lives. We can do precisely what Eddie was just saying. We can build this into what it needs to be to save our society.
Absolutely. And like Che Guevara has this theory that, you become a communist. You don't just, say you're a communist. It's a process of learning and developing and forging yourself in the struggle and learning lessons from engaging in the struggle. And, the same is true for a party, which is constituted of just a bunch of communists, a bunch of individuals coming together as a collective. So, and I mean, to the point about people, the energy being there for a revolution, like everybody understands the Iraq war was based on lies. like George Bush is even admitting it in a speech. It's just, how do we hold them accountable? And like Noah said, it's people have to come to understand that we as the working mass have to hold them accountable. They're never going to hold themselves accountable. Their bourgeois laws mean nothing. The John Bolton, as well as other people in the Bush administration like Elliott Abrams, Paul Bremer, Paul Wolfowitz, these guys were pretty much the architects of neoconservatism, which is just conservatism with interventionist foreign policy. It's like an ideology cooked up in hell by the devil himself to be the worst ideology possible. And essentially, the Bush administration gave expression to this ideology in a political form. And the founding principle of the ideology, if you read what John Bolton actually wrote, is that U.S. domestic law and U.S. interests are above international law. International law essentially means nothing, and the U.S. can do whatever they want. It's just American exceptionalism in a legal form. And people recognize that this is been the modus operandi of the U.S. for the last few years. I mean, even CNN has an article, and this is actually a pretty good article, talking about why the war in Iraq was fought for big oil. I mean, it's not a secret anymore if even CNN is talking about it and admitting it. But I mean, the answer to this also shows that the answer to this is socialism, right? There's no anti-imperialism without socialism. Like we were saying, you can ally with the libertarians, right? But ultimately, the libertarians don't want to do anything about the big oil companies, or maybe they want to bust them up, but they have an unrealistic way of doing it. You know, all they want to do is decrease the size of government. They think everything will work out on its own. You just get rid of the government, then the oil companies will just form private militaries, and they're going to do the same thing, only, you know, with no regulation whatsoever. So the only way to end imperialism is to attack the relations of production, you know, to attack the capitalist ruling class that justifies the imperialism. Because as long as we hyper focus on the political, we're never going to see the root cause, and we're never going to see what's actually going on, because people, like we were saying earlier, treat the Iraq war like it was just one big mistake. It was just one big fumble because George Bush is such a dumb man, you know. But the Iraq war had a winner. You know, it wasn't lost. It was won by big oil. It was won by the finance capitalist class. They plundered Iraq. The Iraqi people say that they've had $150 billion stolen from them since the invasion, right? Pre-war Iraq, the oil was nationalized, and Saddam Hussein was asking for higher quotas for the U.S. to raise the price that they were buying it for, which is part of the reason the U.S. invaded. Post-war Iraq, all of their oil is owned by foreign firms, right? And before the nationalized oil, the surplus of that oil would be reinvested in Iraqi infrastructure, Iraqi homes, the Iraqi people, because it's their own resources and labor, of course. But after that, these foreign multinationals are extracting the surplus made from Iraq back to the West and accumulating. Meanwhile, Iraq is left in this devastated state where extremist groups fight in the power vacuum that the U.S. is kind of trying to stabilize. So it makes you wonder how they justified this like murderous slaughter that was so clearly just done to pillage Iraq's resources. But then you look at the invasions that have happened since then, like Libya, Syria, what's going on with the proxy war against Russia. Like, what's the difference? You know, it's almost like people haven't learned their lesson, or I don't know, have they gotten better at lying? I don't know. Maybe I'm asking you guys.
Yeah, they always justify it in the same way, right? Freedom and democracy. We're saving these people. Yet the results are always the same. People die and things get horribly worse than they were beforehand. So even if that were the case, and let's be real, we all know it's not, that would no longer be a viable reason to do that. And that's why they're forced to sort of admit all these things after the fact and after they're no longer dangerous anymore. You know, I think, and on the point you made right before that, Eddie, which was a really good one, about sort of like people letting things get in the way of coming together, right? And libertarians and stuff. a lot of this, I think, boils down to utopianism. All of us disagree on a particular solution, a conclusion. When, if we're serious about fixing the problem, we need to identify the problem and then come up with what the best solution for the most amount of people is together. If we do that, libertarians become communists real quick, right? Because when you actually narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down, Marxism gives you the answers and not a lot else does.
I just wanted to give maybe a somewhat abrupt shift, but we were talking earlier about these war criminals, and what's interesting is that we can put 25 to 35 million people in the streets during the George Floyd protests because a man was brutally killed, by a racist police officer. And we can ask through that mass movement, not just for justice and police reform and those various things that were asked. Some more radical than others, but at their core, I think the basic level was that at least the people that were a part of it should get prison time. They should get punished for what they did. They killed a man. So I'm wondering whether it'd be a good idea or I don't know, to have like part of a socialist platform be jail all these war criminals. These people have killed millions of people. Jail them. Just because you don't have the clip of them, putting their knee on a person's neck until they die, doesn't mean that they haven't been behind decisions that have killed, women, children, men, teenagers, all sorts of people from all different colors and from all different, all sorts of people, millions of people, so it's, if we're thinking about, that component of justice with regards to these people, I'd say maybe something even worse would be more just. But I think at a basic level, like, have at least investigations to see who, what knowledge did they have before they did these things. And you'll find that they all knew that these fabrications, which were used to justify these wars and these crimes, that these people knew that they were fabricated. These people knew that these, drone strikes were killing 95% civilians or 90% civilians. They knew that, they knew that because they were in textbooks, in literal textbooks at the time that they were still doing it. So if there's any amount of justice, and if the American people can hit the streets in the millions, to protest against one, they should be able to do it against the other where, millions of people are killed.
Yeah, or we could elect Liz Cheney to president, like Robert Reich said. I don't know what the approval rating of John Bolton and these former war criminals or just current war criminals are at. I'm sure they're not very well liked, but the progressives in America think that we should recycle them or have their children run for office again. Here's Robert Reich's other article, Liz Cheney for president, in which he argues that Liz Cheney would be a great president. Let the weapons contractors run things. We need some adults in the room.
It's like they're not even trying to hide that they're an aristocracy. It's wild, man.
And Robert Reich's considered like this progressive professor. It shows, how ridiculous that is, and goes back to what we were saying before about all these people being in the same club.
Yeah. He's considered a leftist who goes on Democracy Now! All the time. And the truth is, he was he Clinton's Treasury Secretary, or I think he was Treasury Secretary or like a labor relations guy, right? I forget, but yeah, he helped design Clinton's economic policies, which were disastrous for the American working class, not to mention the global working class. They were the like NAFTA and I don't want to go up on a whole sidetrack, but
we did a NAFTA segment in the last video because our buddy, the great socialist Voosh, said that he supports NAFTA or that the ideas were good. So I had to explain to the audience how ridiculous that is, and most of them already got it, of course. But yeah, I do think like between the Iraq War and like, well, first like the wars in Libya and Syria were technically NATO, right? What that's basically just the army of finance capital, right? And you can't just pin it on the U.S., even though most of these interventions are led by the U.S. State Department and Western or U.S. based banks and capitalists and stuff. Having the intervention be led by NATO, it's less direct blame placed on U.S. citizens, or less shame that they feel about their country, because it's NATO doing it, not us. But I also think there's probably been an increased in the concentration of the means of communication, and just like a decrease in the amount of people in the establishment media apparatus who have integrity. Right? There's less people like Seymour Hersh bouncing around. It's more just these think tank NGO freaking ghouls who will take anything handed to them by intelligence agencies, anything handed to them by NGOs or apparatuses that serve the deep state or serve finance capital, and they'll publish it and they'll circulate it. And one of the people who and now we're going to talk about the propaganda that was used to justify the pillage and murder that was the Iraq War. But one of the main controversies was Judith Miller, who was writing for the New York Times. She was spoon-fed stories about weapons of mass destruction by U.S. intelligence agencies directly. I believe it was by the CIA, and then published in the New York Times a story claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Not only that, she also exposed the identity of someone who was criticizing the war, which she actually ended up going to jail for before being pardoned by George Bush. Imagine that. And now she does videos for PragerU. But that was a huge scandal, and Judith Miller, eventually she went to jail for a little bit. She had to resign from the New York Times after 28 years. But now it's like you feel like corporate media is getting, or not corporate media, even sometimes outlets like the New York Times that are considered respected are like getting their stories directly from the CIA. And maybe it's always been that way. Maybe I'm naive, but it seems like there's more control now, and social media maybe democratized things for a little bit, but now it's just flooded with freaking bots. Like what's that study we showed the other day? 60 to 80% of people talking about Ukraine, Russia are bots on Twitter. And then 90% of them are pro-Ukraine bots. So the discourse is literally flooded with NATO bots. Every avenue of information is controlled in some way. So I don't know. I feel like it's worse now, but maybe not.
I think it's different now. It's more sophisticated, and it's so much more ever present because the internet is ever present. It used to be that, CNN had CIA agents working there, right? But nowadays they've built the infrastructure that people that do the job that those CIA agents had to do it of their own free will. They've grown up in a place where this is just what creates them, right? And how they're formed. And worse, they believe they're being adversarial and sometimes even revolutionary while doing this, while doing precisely what intelligence agencies and our ruling class have created this sort of thing to do. Gabriel Raquel has a really good sort of thought device for it. And he says that, the CIA don't create puppets, right? They don't create marionettes because to create marionettes, people aren't stupid. They see the strings, they see the puppet master, the CIA, and be above them or whatever. Instead, they build theaters, right? They control the theaters, who gets in, who gets promoted within the theaters, how long they get, etc. And then the marionettes come of their own accord, and it's self-selecting. And that's what Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality, is about, right? It was him noticing this at its very early stage. And if you think about how gamed that is and how easily gamed that is with social media, it's like they have the ability to alter our view of reality these days. And that's fucking terrifying.
Absolutely. Especially if you consider especially if you consider, as I do at least, that we've entered into a new stage of identity formation. We very much, we've talked before about the analysis of Hans-Georg Moeller and Patti Ambrosio on prophilicity. I teach their book in class, and the argument is that we've got into a stage of identity formation where people's identities, personal identities, are tied to their profiles, and the development of their identity is tied to the development of curating their profile, and their profile is very much based on the reactions that they get from the people that are following them and the people that engage with their accounts. They call this the general peer. And when you have a situation where the Silicon Valley capitalists, in conjunction with the CIA and the FBI and the State Department institutions, are able to control the general peer, the interactions that are made with people's accounts, they're controlling, in essence, how it is that that person shapes their identity in relationship to how they are seen as being seen by everyone else, by the general peer. And so I would say that the main difference is that whereas in the early 2000s, there was still the capacity to somewhat separate the individual as the authentic individual. We were still under the paradigm of authenticity from their political views. They can go home and their political views were somewhat separated. Today, you don't have that. Today, you look at people's bios and it's their identity. They have the Ukraine flag. During the BLM protest, they put the black square. They just go with the flow of whatever the general peer is going with, and the general peer is fully controlled by capital, right? Not only in the sense of bots, but also in the sense of repressing, in the forms of banning, as we've experienced, in the forms of shadow bans, as we've experienced. And I did a concrete study about this where I lay out what prophilicity is and how it's used by imperialism in an article I called Imperialism and Prophilicity. And I look at the case of Bolivia, because in Bolivia, there was 69,000 bots that were found to shift the narrative during the 2019 coup against Evo Morales, which input Jenny Añez, a fascist, a literal fascist and racist, who had said tremendously racist things about the indigenous people in the area, and who, when she ran, she had like 3% of the vote that year, and they were able to successfully carry this out, not just through the repressive apparatuses of the state. It wasn't just force, but it was also shaping the narrative, which allowed the populace, which could have came out had they been able to, see the truth, to somewhat stay at home and to get, liberal-minded people who are very much moved by sentimentality and appeals to their liberal moralisms, to get those people to be quiet or to go with the flow in favor of the coup against Evo Morales, the first indigenous president ever, because they had those 69,000 bots. And then what it does in places like Twitter is that it makes things trend. And when things are trending, it goes from being bots that like have the likes and the shares and the quote tweets and the tweets to being real people. And the fakes are used as a medium so that more real people end up seeing this and shaping who they are, their identities and their political opinions in accordance with this mass control that the ruling class has over bots and over information today. So it's much more ingrained, much deeper, and much more insidious because people don't even realize that it's happening. So it's a battle unlike ever before.
And we
It's so
need to come
dark.
up with something to combat this with. We need our own bots at the very least, or a way to get rid of it. We need to combat this. In 2023, the war of positions is the most important battle right now. We have no capability to wage a war of what's the other one?
Maneuver.
Thank you. We have no capability. In order to do that, we need a war of positions. We need to win the information war, whatever you want to call it, propaganda, doesn't matter. We need something to combat this. And that means we need to think beyond just protesting. We need to think beyond what they tell us is what you do when you're angry at the system, right? We need to think outside the box.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we do with our TikTok organizing and outreach and stuff like that is important. But I mean, you see now how fast they've been able to ban us, and at the same time as these Ukraine, pro NATO bots are being pushed out, there are voices telling the truth that are being banned and suppressed. You had the Hamilton 68 dashboard that was exposed recently, where State Department connected think tank was pressuring Twitter to delete all these accounts that they said were Russian bots, but were in fact just people telling the truth. And TikTok deleted 30,000 accounts, which they said were all Russian bots. Of course, they weren't. It was people like us who had, nearly 400,000 followers on our Midwestern Marx account, which is what happens if you allow, a Marxist-Leninist message to actually get out without suppression, is it becomes very popular. So they have no choice but to suppress us. But now it's like instantly we can be banned because of how quickly these bots will find our account, and how quickly hate can be diverted towards us. They can do it just in a Discord server. People can coordinate a mass reporting campaign, and then there are literal NATO operatives and former State Department officials managing TikTok's content. So they're not going to do anything about it. Twitter, put up a little bit of resistance to that Hamilton 68 dashboard, but certainly not as much as they could. So it's really dark. And I remember like watching TikTok kind of transform into this from an app that really had more freedom of speech into what it is now, is like made me like, oh geez, do we have a chance here to win this propaganda war? We do, because every time we make a new TikTok account, it immediately blows up and we get thousands of followers because people want the truth. But it is going to be difficult. And like Carlos said, more so than I see bots posting things that go viral, you almost never see that. I almost never see an account that I think is a bot post something that goes viral. What I see is someone I know who posts something that I disagree with, or maybe lends itself to imperialism or liberalism, that explodes because bots are sent to like it. And then those people drift more towards posting stuff like that because they get this dopamine response. They get this serotonin from having their tweet or whatever liked by bots. So then, as Carlos said, that makes people more inclined, that changes how they think and who they are to be more like that. So you get a bunch of bots that just like people's tweets every time they say something imperialistic, and people are going to be more inclined to do that because it's fun to have people like your tweets and feel popular. And it's not fun to get attacked and be called a genocide denier and all these things.
And these people still have the gall of talking about the marketplace of ideas, the free marketplace of ideas. I often think, where would we, and, we've grown a lot over the last year or so, ever since we got banned, but where would we be if that 400K follower account was able to stay around and we were the only voice or one of the few voices on TikTok saying the truth about Ukraine? Where will we be in terms of our TikTok size and in terms of how TikTok functioned as a segue to promote the other parts of the institute, which include the website, but the other social media platforms, and now that we have a publishing press, our books, and our Patreon, like the immense effect that has had on our project is something I often think about. And the difficulty is that I was talking with Noah about this the other day, and everyone is in these apps. Like TikTok is the fastest growing app and the most popular app in the United States. Unfortunately, whenever I go to the living room and my mom's home from work, even she's on TikTok. It's no longer like a little kid thing. It's everyone's on there, and we've been essentially banned from the most popular marketplace of ideas in the country. And it's just ridiculous. And if you say, well, let's make another app that's like, you have free speech and it's for socialists and all this other shit. Well, who's going to go on there? The point of these apps is that these are already where people are, and say that people go there, right? Say that at least the base goes there. Where would you host it? Because Apple has the power of removing the apps. Google has the power of removing the apps. Google and Bing have the power of not having your thing show up when you put it. So at all times they have such a centralized control over the means of communication, the technological means of communication, that regardless of what counter response you make to their censorship, even if you make your own thing, it can pull the rug under you because even the floor is owned by them.
Mhm. And this is why we always, always, always say organization begins in your workplace. It doesn't begin with arguing online or like ratioing someone on Twitter or whatever you want to do. It begins in your workplace. From there, broader organizations can coordinate things like this. Because Google can do this excuse me, because Google can do this to us now does not mean that will always be the case. We are capable of fighting back. We are smart enough to do it, and we are strong enough to do it. What it takes is the dedication, the will, and the organization.
Right. I was gonna say there are definitely ways to get around this or combat this. Like for one, you have a diverse spread of followers. You put yourself on different platforms, which is what we've done. And we've learned that from our first account. We were kind of just building TikTok, and slowly transferring people to YouTube, but we didn't put enough focus on it and kind of thinking they won't take our giant TikTok account away, and they did. But you can coordinate things and organize people on a different platform. You could organize people in a Discord server, so then you can every time you get banned, you can send people to the new account, or we can do things strategically. But what it takes is organization and coordination between multiple people. Like one of the mistakes I feel like I've made organizing the most since getting into all this stuff is trying to do too much on my own, trying to just do everything by myself, rather than coordinating, working together with people, and forming real organizations that can respond in a real way strategically to things like a ban on TikTok and things like that. So yeah, did you want to keep going with the Iraq segment, Noah, or do you need to hit the hay soon?
I probably soon. Yeah, I am very old, as you know. So
For sure. I'm going to finish the Iraq segment if it kills me. So you guys can feel free to tag out whenever you want.
I'm with you for the Iraq segment, brother. And then probably after that. But yeah, ask Carlos. I've had a week at work this week. So like it's been the minute I get up to, 12 hours later every day. And it's a whole
class
thing.
Hero.
But
here
yeah,
you are,
I'm here.
Educating the masses still.
By the way, the crew I was working with today and 2 days ago love Midwestern March. They especially like your live streams during the day, Eddie. They watch them they watch them every time they come on.
That is amazing to hear. Thank you. Tell them thank you, and I appreciate the support, and I'm glad that I can entertain them.
I will. If you say hi to Kevin, he'll freak out. So
okay, I will for sure. For sure. That's awesome to hear. That's one of my favorites, either when people tell me they're listening to the streams at work or when other wrestlers come up at tournaments, like college wrestlers all the time. Every tournament, there's at least one. I love you guys' show, but I'm pessimistic about if change is possible. And within the Imperial Core, everyone here is too bribed by their goodies. I mean, that's like everything that Americans used to say, and thank you so much for the super chat, GQ. Everything that Americans used to say, like we can't have a revolution here, socialism isn't possible here, is just an aspect of capitalism that exists everywhere. Like we have a lot of consumerism, yeah, but that's always been a thing. Like that's one of the things about commodity fetishism is that when the product of the labor process is alienated from that labor process and there's just a whirlwind of commodities going around in the market at all times, it makes it hard to like get your bearings. It makes it hard to see the truth of the system. It creates an illusion and makes it hard to see the actual labor process that created all these products we're surrounded with. And that becomes worse with advertising, and consumerism that comes about post-Marx. But ultimately, it's the same commodity fetishism that conceals the truth of the system. And the answer is education, showing people that, the relations of production at the core of society are based on exploitation, and they're what lead to imperialism and all the negative things in people's lives. And I don't know. I guess I don't think people are that obsessed with consumerism, and also like socialism isn't taking away anyone's goodies, unless you have like slaves or, some like you have like 4 mansions or something.
Right.
We want to increase the productive forces and grow rich and strong and powerful together rather than have a few of us grow rich off the backs of the others.
And
So
if
that really
Good
ties
question.
into my theory of reproletarianization, because I think GQ in the last period of American history, you'd be correct, and specifically the white part of the proletariat, the working class, was kind of bribed in a way, but they became no longer part of the proletariat at that point, and no longer the revolutionary agent. Because of this, right? They were a middle class that had a form of stability. Like one of the things Engels said was, if you own a home, you're not really a worker anymore. Now that was in his condition, etc. But what he was getting at is, if you're not in the role of societal reproduction, unable to accumulate any forms of stability, then you are able to have revolutionary potential, right? I'm sorry, I got lost in my own head there for a minute. But
Happens
what's
to all of us.
happening? What's happening now, especially since the end of the last era, right? Is we're seeing a sort of reproletarianization happening. All of these middle classes are dying away. The tech revolution changes everything. Full financialization and debt change everything. There's so much value manipulation happening, both on the front end of it before production and speculation, and then on the back end with interest rate meddling and buybacks and currency exchange rate manipulation, things like this. They're causing this new class of people to form, or not really, it doesn't matter, but this new section of people to form that are thrust down back again into societal reproduction. They're unable to accumulate any stability. They're looking backwards at a middle class life of their parents who lived in the suburbs and had a white picket fence and 2.3 kids and a dog and all that. Happy lives, and forward to a life of menial service labor and debt, crushing debt. And so when you say that people are bribed by goodies, I say, where are those goodies? Right? Because 60% or so of Americans struggle paycheck to paycheck. A fifth of our kids go to sleep hungry every night.
60% of the country experiences medical debt.
Precisely.
60%.
I want to mention something that's not usually talked about by Marxists, especially when they talk about debt, because they don't read the 3 volumes. In the 3rd volume of Capital, Marx talks about that form of debt as being a secondary exploitation. He says, talking about the development of this debt already in a very embryonic form at his time, he says, this is secondary exploitation, which runs parallel to the primary exploitation taking place in the production process itself.
Precisely. And that is central to reproletarianization, that debt. It has to come into existence for the board. I don't want to get sort of lost in reproletarianization, but yeah, this is absolutely dependent on debt, and people do not read the 2nd or 3rd volume of Capital.
And it's also the comment I was going to make with the super chat was that it's also like not the case. Like today, you can't say, well, that's the case with the U.S., but nowhere else in the world is that consumerism that rampant. That's just not true today, because everywhere else in the world, you look at their major cities, and they're basically identical to the major cities in the U.S., especially in capitalist countries, right? And this is, part of the cosmopolitization of major cities, and that has brought with it consumerism, rampant consumerism. So the sort of lifestyle that you had in or that you have in parts of the major cities in the U.S. is also found in other countries, in every one of their major cities, but it's also not found like in the Midwest. When I moved from Miami, where the main concern in people were their sneakers and their clothes, and I fell for that stupidity. I was what they called a sneakerhead, and I was lining up to buy Jordans every Friday and stuff, and it's completely ridiculous. But that sort of rampant consumerism that's instilled in people from a very young age, I didn't find that in the Midwest. Like people's clothes were from the thrift store, and they just didn't care. Like there was such a hospitable family environment. Maybe not in big cities in the Midwest like Chicago and stuff, but in small towns, that rampant consumerism didn't exist. So I do think that it's a part more so of the metropolis, the cosmopolitan major cities, where you find that consumerism. You don't find that in small U.S. towns, and you do find it basically in every other major town in the rest of the world.
It's part of PMC culture. It's part of, you go to Whole Foods and pick out only the GMO free organic pears that cost $11 each, rather than, like most people going to Aldi's and getting just a bag of pears. Right.
Right. There is, like, I know in my hometown there, people would argue about their trucks. Right. And maybe that's more like people's parents who owned farms rather than people who worked on the farms, a lot of times, because a lot of those farms start to get pretty big and the owners start to get pretty wealthy, even in small towns. But Carlos is totally right. I was actually kind of shocked coming to Loris and meeting, I just pretty much doxed the college version of us. But the college we went to had a lot of suburban Chicago kids, and I was shocked by the consumerism. I'm like, oh, these guys actually, like, they flex on other people. I'm like, I thought that was kind of a joke. Maybe you flex your truck, but even that's kind of a joke still. But yeah, I don't know. But that goes to shows our other theory that different parts of America have essentially different cultures and need to be organized uniquely and have different contradictions and things that need to be overcome.
I also think it's a generational thing, Eddie.
Yeah.
Have you seen Chris Smalls too? That testifies to it. You can't be more working class than the guy that organized a union and the second largest employer. But look at how he's dressing now. It's just like the culture of the
right.
cosmopolitan life. That's all I was dressing.
$3,500 jacket that says "Eat the Rich." Unreal. It's like, speaking of empty cosmopolitanism, or what was the Soviet word? Groundless cosmopolitan. Oh God, Dimitrov called them something real funny. Anyway, it doesn't matter. In New York City, right, like the heart of all cosmopolitanism, there is an ice cream truck called Eat the Rich, right? And they sell like little ice creams with Jeff Bezos' head, Carl Schwab, like Bill Gates, just everybody. And they're like $15 a pop, man. Only rich people can afford these popsicles. It's to the point where it's ironic that like part of cosmopolitanism has become pretending they're us, right? Pretending they're regular working class people. I only found this out recently because I'm old and out of touch, but Carhartt is now worn by hipsters. Carhartt's like just the crap we wear at work because it's good for work. It's unreal. And by the way, I'm still mad at hipsters for taking mustaches away.
Yeah, that is unfortunate, isn't it?
Right?
I'm not letting them take Carhartts. They're too warm.
What?
I'm not letting them take Carhartts. They're too warm and too nice.
Preach, brother. Yeah. They took mustaches, but we need to take Carhartts back.
There's that guy Fender something from
Fetterman.
Fetterman.
He just pretends he's working class by putting a Carhartt on.
I wonder if that would be like the next like romanticized and fetishized identity marker for
working
like
class
politics. Yeah, once they get tired of like all other identity markers, and once those others are like equally represented in the PMC and in the lapdog media and in the bourgeoisie, I wonder if then the identity marker they get obsessed with is working class. You're already kind of seeing a shift towards that in certain parts of fashion, with like Round Two and these different projects that just love thrifted vintage clothes. And I mean, I was in those circles some years ago, but that was just those were like working class clothes from the 90s that are
Mhm.
just coming back now as popular, and being bought for hundreds of dollars by very rich people. Um, and they're like shirts with holes on them and stuff, and
Mhm.
it's kind of absurd if you think about it. I mean, they're sometimes nice articles of clothing, but it is a sort of fetishization of like the aesthetic of poor working class folk.
It's
You
like
know,
that college humor video where someone comes in with holes with jeans and the teacher's like, you can't wear those, and then someone else comes in, they're like wearing a box, they're like using poverty as their new fashion.
it reminds me of the movie Zoolander and Mugatu's line, "derelict."
I love that
But
movie.
like, it's when we found out about Carhartt, my wife sent me this meme, and she knows like everybody, all the guys I work with, and I everything is calling each other white trash or trailer kid and whatever, because I mean all of us kind of are, but um she sent me this meme that said, if you're gonna wear Carhartt, you best be doing Carhartt shit, right? And it's like all these pictures and like a fake Carhartt hat on. It's like getting a DUI, falling behind on child support. It was a
Oh
good
man,
meme, one of my favorites.
that's too good. Duck Hash Browns, thank you for the $5 super chat, and thank you for being a YouTube member. Double support. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Kanye
Doc.
sold clothes where he admitted that he was inspired by the homeless in New York City for outrageous amounts. Good Lord.
Jesus.
That's wild. And today, I don't know if we'll get to it, but um, I've got a story to cover at some point about the company town that Elon
Mhm.
wants to create. And it's like, he's literally buying up, acres of land to build this town. And in the article, it says he discussed his business plan with Kanye West and his ex-girlfriend Grimes. I'm like, what kind of weird freaking simulation world do we live in, where we're all going
It's
to
a
be living
nightmare
and
joke.
working for Kanye West, Grimes, and Elon Musk in the company town?
It reminds me of
Fordism was replaced by this.
it reminds me of Kanye, like right when he was taking the insanity route, and he was already saying completely absurd things about like slavery, but he said something that was hilarious. He was talking about Polaroid, and Taylor Swift was contracted as executive director of Polaroid, and he's like, "I love Gaga. What the hell does she know about cameras?" And it's like, what what does Grimes and Kanye have to what do they paint there? What's their role? But yeah, I mean these company towns. Maybe I won't say much because I know we want to do a segment on it. But there was a really good article a few issues ago in a magazine that we normally disagree with, but Jacobin, and they were going through like the history of company towns and how they function. And it's incredible the level of yeah, it's incredible the level of not subservience, but the level of um, dependency that they're able to create through that. Because in a lot of those company towns, what you had was the currency that the workers were paid on, was company money that they could use in the company stores. So, like, if they were able to save up the smallest amount of money, they couldn't use it anywhere else besides the company town.
And that's scary that they're trying to bring this back, because that is precisely the whole goal for capitalists is to make us dependent on them. That's what imperialism's about.
Absolutely. I mean, that would be the ultimate expression of capitalism, almost, to just be, or at least concentrated monopoly capitalism, to just be under one person, which is, I mean, Elon owns shares in so many major firms and so many major industries. That's part of the reason why he's able to do this. But finally, returning to Iraq a little bit, we got a little bit sidetracked, which is totally fine. But we've been talking about how everybody is aware, that the Iraq War was based on lies, and that it was for oil companies, that it created ISIS, all these terrible things. So it's like, how did they lie us into it? But then when you see how easily, a lot of people are tricked into supporting like the proxy war against Russia right now, or the wars and interventions in Libya and Syria in the past decade, it's like, oh, have we really, learned anything? Or sometimes I think a lot of regular people are actually against these interventions, and now we're seeing that culminate in more protests and things, and a real anti-imperialist movement in the U.S. But what was I saying? Oh, but also when the war drums are beating, it seems like more people are in favor of the intervention, because you have like bots and corporate media is making it seem that way. But either way, part of the way they lied the public into the Iraq War was John Bolton, this architect of neoconservatism, labeled Iraq, Iran, North Korea the axis of evil, and they were listed as rogue states and state sponsors of terrorism, alongside Cuba, Syria, and Libya. So Cuba and North Korea, who are both under stringent embargo, Syria and Libya, who the U.S. would go on to invade about 10 years after Iraq, or NATO, specifically, but led by the U.S., and then Iran, who the U.S. has obviously kept under stringent economic sanctions and is one of the main targets of imperialist aggression today. So by labeling them as state sponsors of terror and rogue states and the axis of evil, it's really giving an expression to what we always say, that they try and make these foreign countries that the U.S. is enemies with out to be comic book villains. They're literally the axis of the evil, right? They are evil. Carlos was saying earlier he doesn't know if there should be a word, or that we should use the word evil. I think we should, for people like John Bolton, though, who portray other countries as evil so he can kill millions of innocent people in those countries. Because, the Marxist analysis of evil should just be, how do you use your life materially? Because you only get one life, and John Bolton used his life to murder millions of people by calling them evil. So that's evil to me. Bolton also personally derailed the Geneva Convention's efforts to inspect for biological weapons. So they were going to, carry out the regular process of inspection when the U.S. was accusing them of having WMDs, and John Bolton and the U.S. were the only country to say, no, you can't go ahead with this. We don't support this. Took away their ability to do it, which shows that John Bolton knew. He actively knew there were no WMDs, but I have to lie to the American public in order to create this war on the basis of WMDs. Like that event shows that this whole thing he was planned out in his head ahead of time, which is why he's one of the core architects of this intervention. You got something to say, Carlos?
Yeah, at least he's taking back the mustache from the hipsters, though.
That's true. That's true. What's worse, the hipsters or the neocons having it?
The hipsters are becoming neocons anyway, so they're just as bloodthirsty, and it's for the same reason. They just call something else freedom and democracy, right?
If the neocons can figure out like good emojis to tie to their movements, the hipsters would be all over it. Anything that is tied to putting emojis on bios, flags, or any small symbol that you can access through an iPhone.
A bunch of flags, like flags, hammer and sickle emojis.
Yeah.
A bunch of, for some reason, the one that always like made me think is like mental illnesses. That's part of it. I don't know why, but it is.
Well, there's studies. There was this documentary on happiness that was on Netflix for a while, and it referenced a study where, like,
it's about a movie from a movie from Netflix. Really?
Yeah, but it referenced a study that I was able to look at after. And after a certain amount of money, your psychology is affected. And someone in the chat had mentioned it earlier. Like, you literally stop being able to tell the emotions on someone else's face. And obviously, these politicians, they're not directly the finance monopolists which are funding them, but they are being funded by them, and their lifestyles are a lot closer to the lifestyles of the billionaires and to the lifestyles of the people who they quote unquote represent, right? So I do think that it's not unfair to mention the psychological dimension behind these phenomena. After all, we're trying to look at things in a comprehensive manner, which means, yeah, the base is economics, geopolitical economy, but also, part of the other factors that we can take into account is psychology. And it's without a doubt that studies show that after a certain amount of money, you're just a nut job. Basically,
Right.
all human characteristics are basically gone.
And any working class person who knows somebody that got rich or married a rich person, like you see how fast it happens. Like even if they don't become a jerk, they just like forget what it's like to not have a lot of money and not
Mhm.
know where maybe know where your next meal is coming from. And they kind of expect then everyone around them to act the same way. And um,
I see that in Theo Vaughn. I love watching comedians, and Theo Vaughn is he's this quirky guy. He says the most brilliant stupid things I've ever heard in my life.
he does.
He's from Louisiana, and he was like dirt poor his whole life, and now because he's so successful in comedy, he's around people who have money, and he's constantly saying how it just the way that the minds of these people operate, it just doesn't really make much sense to him, and he's embarrassed to like show off and wear a specific type of clothing, and um, but it is an important factor because at the end of the day, it's like this is a system, but the system needs personalized agents to fit the roles. And these agents, are not they're not responsible in the way that the system is, but they are guilty of the mass crimes that the system created a position for someone to do, and they were the ones that did it.
Absolutely. No, I want to give you the chance to sign out before I start rambling about Iraq again.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. I tried valiantly to kick it with the young guys late at night with the whippersnappers, but didn't work.
Solidarity, Noah. Thank you for your
For sure.
efforts.
For sure. Solidarity.
We're
One
glad to
last
have
thing
you.
before I go. Chuki Torla for the St. Patrick's Day. So good night,
Oh
everybody.
yeah, we haven't met. It's St. Patty's Day, so happy
Yeah, I got the
Patty's Day.
IRA pin. There it is.
There you
I
go.
was halfway through celebration. I had someone asked about drinking. I was halfway through my celebration when Eddie told me to stream, so I put a pause to it. But
I figured
we'll
I'd just make the stream more interesting.
Have a good night, fellas.
we'll
Bye,
finish it.
everybody.
Good night, Noah. Take care, brother.
So thanks to Noah for hanging out with us before he had to go to bed. For those who don't know, Noah works all day like a true proletarian man. So he wakes up really early in the morning to read theory and then stays up past his bedtime to stream with us. So true dedication there, and we're happy that he was able to be with us.
I don't know if you guys can notice he had like paint in his hands. How many other Marxist channels can say that they have real proletarians out here doing theory, reading, writing, editing, doing all the sorts of stuff that we have going on in our.
I'm pretty sure I saw Vaush had concrete on his shirt. I'm pretty
Oh.
sure he works concrete in the summers in Beverly Hills.
He might have bought it off a concrete worker just to
Can you splatter that on me? These Midwestern
Yeah.
Marx guys keep making fun of me. So along with John Bolton and Madeleine Albright and all these war criminals who have been praised and rehabilitated, and Dick Cheney as well, there's this guy who Carlos was so kind to pull up a picture of before the stream. This is Colin Powell lying to the UN, saying that there was biological evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was made up. Who knows what's in that vial he's holding up there? It's not weapons of mass destruction, that's for sure.
It's cocaine.
What's that?
It's cocaine.
Yeah, it's Colin Powell's personal supply. So They were
It was-
lucky that he had that when they were going to the UN.
he was like, how do I get past this check with cocaine in my pocket? And he's like, I'm gonna use this and say that it's proof of weapons of mass destruction. So it was actually him trying to get away from getting in trouble over the coke he had just bought off Miami. And
It all started when they stopped him at TSA.
that could be
No,
like
no.
a Netflix special, you know? It all started when they stopped him in TSA. That's the first lines of the Netflix show.
And he's watching Operation Shock and Awe, and he's like, that's when I knew that I fucked up. I destroyed an entire country.
To not get in trouble for coke. Oh god.
But I mean, it's crazy that he held up a little vial, isn't it? And he knew he was lying. He knew there was nothing there. He knew that John Bolton had halted the investigation into biological weapons. And the Scott Ritter, who now does commentary about the war in Ukraine, he was the weapons inspector, like for the UN or some really high up government body from 1991 to 1998. And he said Iraq doesn't have the capability to make weapons of mass destruction right now. This doesn't make any sense. This is based on lies, and was a vocal critic of the war all the way up. 2000, he published a book, 2002, another one. He had resigned in 1998 in protest because he realized something fishy was going on. And then was a vocal critic all the way up until 2003, openly saying, there's no way Iraq could have weapons of mass destruction. He was the one leading the investigation, but nobody listened to Scott Ritter. Instead, they listened to Colin Powell, and they did exactly what they wanted to do, which CNN and others have published articles like the media's failure on the Iraq war, like still stings, and basically just giving themselves, like reprimanding themselves for how bad they failed in the Iraq war. But as with George Bush, they didn't fail. They didn't make a mistake. They did it on purpose, right? They knew there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and they actively lied about it. They actively did everything they could to prevent an actual investigation from going down. Because they knew that they wanted to use weapons of mass destruction as the basis, as the justification for regime change. And then, when 9/11 happened, it just made it all the easier for the U.S. to lie us into these investigations. Bush's approval rating shot up to like 90% after 9/11 as the country was coming together. And, rather than using all that unity that our country had at that point to do something good, he used it to lie us into this murderous intervention, which is why, people or the conspiracy theory exists that Bush did 9/11 because it fits so well with the U.S.'s war on terror plot, this qualitative shift in U.S. imperialism away from the Cold War and towards the war on terror. But even if you don't, buy into the conspiracy theory about Bush doing 9/11, well, then the evidence shows that Osama bin Laden did 9/11, who the U.S. funded and armed when he was fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, when he was the leader of the Mujahideen, which would later splinter into Al-Qaeda and other groups like the ETIM, who the U.S. has recently used to attack China. But either way, the U.S. created these terror groups that did 9/11. So regardless of whether it was planned or not, it was used as a propaganda tool. They jumped on it and utilized it to get millions more people killed. And in 2003, then, after years of lying, and 2 years after 9/11, the Iraq War was launched with what's called Operation Shock and Awe, or actually that was the military strategy that was used, where essentially the U.S. just hit Iraq with bombs out of nowhere, destroying the country, blowing up their infrastructure. There's an article about the U.S. funding Osama bin Laden when they called him a freedom fighter, a peace warrior, putting his country on the road to peace before he would do 9/11 and have his group splinter into Al-Qaeda. So the last piece of propaganda I wanted to talk about is that all the U.S. officials at this point in the early 2000s, they were all saying over and over and over again, this is going to be quick. This is going to be short. We're going to be in and out. We're going to get Saddam and we're going to leave. But, of course, 2023, and we're still there because they toppled Saddam and quickly realized that there was nobody left to run the government. And what they tried doing was bringing these Iraqi exiles who had been exiled out of the country, usually for like committing crimes or treason, or they had just gotten on Saddam's bad side, But a lot of these people were just, puppets of the U.S. And that's who they, tried installing to run the government. And before I talk about the attempt to reconstruct the Iraqi government, I'll let you jump in if you have anything to add, Carlos, at this point.
Well, yeah, I know we touched on it. I guess in the first part of the conversation, but the role of the absence of the Soviet Union, because it was the only global force in the world that was capable of stopping the adventures of the U.S. and NATO in every part of the world, right? So you have with the seeming fall of communism, you have the turn towards the other being Muslim people in these Muslim countries and the fight against terrorism, the war on terror. And, not only are there millions of deaths that are a result of the sanction regimes and the bombing campaigns in those regions, but that could have been potentially prevented had an entity like the Soviet Union been around to fight back against imperialism. But you also have Eastern Europe itself and the regions which made up the Soviet Union being converted into the first states in modern history to demodernize. All the modernization that had been achieved thanks to the Soviet Union was all destroyed. And in many metrics, they were even worse off than when they were in Tsarist Russia. But you also have not just, free reign for the U.S. empire in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe and in parts of Africa and Asia, but also free reign at home, right? It all coincides with the lives of Americans getting worse and worse and worse because they're unable to have, an alternative that they can look at and see, wow, look how good the people, working class people, are living in the Soviet Union, a state that's ran by working class people. That was always a threat to the U.S. just in terms of image, the image of an alternative. Without that alternative in place, the wraths of capital do not only extend far beyond they ever did in other parts of the world, but they also extend inward into the lives of American people and this whole process that Noah calls reproletarianization and the destruction of the middle class and the impoverishing of American communities and American people has been connected to this whole transformation in geopolitics that has been largely a result of the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. So,
absolutely, it's hard to understate the effect that it had, and that's what I was trying to that's why I wanted to make that point when talking about the Gulf War, of the qualitative shift in U.S. imperialist policy. And the Gulf War coincided with like the super short invasion of Panama and like that one video Carlos said, like 7 invasions in 5 years. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, it's just like boom, 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 boom. The U.S. did all these imperialist projects that they had wanted to do forever, but the Soviet Union wouldn't allow. Thank you for the super chat, by the way, Justin. Appreciate that. And what's so crazy too is after Saddam was toppled, George Bush declared mission accomplished. He went on TV after this and said, we did it. We got rid of that horrible, evil dictator. And at this point, they started bringing in Iraqi exiles to run the government. But in addition to that, and this is one of the most interesting things that I learned about the Iraq War while doing this research, is that the U.S. set up a government based on religious and ethnic groups. So they set up a government based on Shia, Kurdish, and Sunni religious and ethnic groups who had never before, or which had never been before, been the dividing lines for Iraqi politics. They had a secular state. And then the U.S. came in, toppled their government, and put in this Shia Kurdish Sunni state that was supposed to be run by Iraqi exiles who hadn't been in the country for years and years and years, and they thought this government was going to work. But what happened was these extremist groups started forming along these political lines that the U.S. had created. So, you had Shia and Sunni now fighting each other in Iraq when they never had before. And that's what the US tells us too, as justification when we got to go into one of these places, or why the Middle East is fighting, or why there are these terror groups. Oh, it's just the Sunnis and the Shias can't get along. What do we do about it? How do we ever overcome it? When in reality, a lot of these places were secular, and the US created these divides, or at least stoked them. So this was a really interesting video I found from Al Jazeera, and I recommend people watch the whole thing if you're not super familiar with Iraq.
There was there was an old saying, which was that if you see two neighbors fighting, a British came to town that day, or something along those lines. But I think you can use that with the U.S. That's what they do around the world. They stoke divisions in order to have the sort of elements out of which they can craft a narrative that justifies their projects abroad. And that sort of divide and conquer strategy is not just used outside; it's also used at home, and we tend to forget that in how it applies to the discourses that the left has and the way that the left splinters pretty much on every issue, even when it's not over things of substance, just over terms and stuff. But yeah,
absolutely.
Iraq, the three main demographic groups are the Shia majority and the Sunni and Kurdish minorities. Under Saddam, Iraq was technically a secular state, but it was the Sunnis who generally held the positions of power. But the new political system was based on the idea that the three main groups should share power. There's an unofficial arrangement where the prime minister, who really runs the country, is always Shia, the president is Kurdish, and the speaker of parliament is Sunni. And that model served the interests of all those Iraqi exiles who designed it and planned to come back and take charge.
So how do you, returning to a country after decades of exile, build constituents? You don't know these people. You don't know any, the way you do it is by building these kind of imagined communities based on ethnicity or sect. All of a sudden, you have these parties come, and they're now creating sectarianism and ethnic divides. And Iraqis are now beginning to find out from their friends, oh, I guess my friend is a Sunni, or I guess my friend is a Shia. It never really mattered before.
Now, the other problem.
So how interesting is that, given the fact that we're told it's the Sunni-Shia divide that leads to all this fighting? And is really relevant because China just brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who for years the U.S. told us, one of these countries is Sunni, one's Shia, they'll never get along. When in reality, it was the fact that Iran wasn't serving U.S. geopolitical interests and Saudi Arabia was. So the U.S. was going to give their support to Saudi Arabia and not to Iran. Also, what else does this show? That it shows the divisive nature of politics based on, exclusively on identity, on your religious identity, on your ethnic identity, on your racial identity, right? It replaces a politics based on class, and it leads to division because, it's this idea ultimately that those divisions, are racial, ethnic, religious divisions, can't be overcome, which is not true. They can be overcome and we can get along. Which is why, but the ruling class likes to beat us over the head with this idea that we can't, right? And inject as many different kinds of divisions as they can into society, into the masses. And that's what they did in Iraq on a systematic level. And that is what created the basis for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all these different extremist groups. It was the US's attempt to set up a government based on different identity groups, an identity politics-based government run by a bunch of literal exiles who hadn't been in the country for decades. Like, the fact that they even thought this was going to work, it's so absurd. And like in Libya, this is what they did, but they learned their lesson. They just left, right? They just dipped out and left the country in chaos. In Iraq, they stayed and tried to stabilize things, and it was a disaster. It didn't work, and they didn't want the same thing to happen that happened in South Vietnam, where they were just chased out, and the government the U.S. tried to leave up just collapsed immediately.
and it's important to note that the big other transformed from being communism to the war on terror. But what's special about the war on terror is that the big other is materially created by the US and the imperialist forces. So they literally funded and created their own enemy in order to fight against that enemy for the next 30 years at least. Um, and it's really despicable, right? But it's the same thing as the war on drugs, right? The biggest drug cartel is the U.S. state, by far. All these drug cartels, they have connections with U.S. state departments, and they're promoted by the same departments that claim to be fighting a war on drugs and that are profiting from a war on drugs. And I believe it was gosh, what's this guy? The British guy, Russell Brand. He was recently, I think, on Rogan, and he was talking about it. When you have a society where the arms manufacturers make money from war, the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex makes money from sickness, and the people supposedly fighting against to get drugs off the street make money from that, right? You're creating material incentives so that the organizations that are supposed to fight against one thing are actually the main reason why those things are being proliferated, and that's just capitalism. That's just what it is, and how it translates itself into the search for profit in all areas of society. And it says something about American capitalism in specific, that in the 70s, when the rate of profit had fallen in every productive industry to the point where the decision was either leave the country and get labor that you can super exploit somewhere else, or turn towards financialization, the only two places that continued to function in the U.S. in a form that where profit was not derived from speculative financial finance capital, but derived from actual productive industries, was the military industrial complex and the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex, both of which have in some way or another been related to massive deaths, not just around the world, but in the US. And you've referenced in your article the role that the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex has played in the opium epidemic in the U.S., where I believe it's 10,000 people that are killed a year from overdoses, and in total it's been, since it started, well over 100,000 that have died from overdosing. So it's a deeply sick society, and I like to call it a comprehensive crisis, because it's not only a crisis in the rate of profit falls and people can buy. It's a crisis that has affected every sphere of social life, and I think the vast majority of people are coming to see that in ways that they have never seen it before. But you mentioned the role that China played in mediating relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I don't know if we have yet to discuss how the implications of that geopolitically. It's so incredibly huge, especially because part of the same meetings, one of the things that was implied in the meeting was that Saudi Arabia was going to begin selling oil in yuan, which means that the petrodollar is dead. And if the petrodollar is dead, then U.S. Dollar hegemony is pretty soon to be dead, which means that the sanctions regime are not going to have the same level of influence as they had before. So it's you're genuinely we are living in a very special period in history where we are witnessing before our eyes the collapse of a world and the birthing of another.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I had to mention about Iraq was, one, they got rid of every member of the Socialist Ba'ath Party, which Saddam Hussein, as Noah mentioned earlier, had already gotten rid of all the left-wing members, when he was backed by the CIA. And then the U.S. with the invasion just pretty much got rid of the party in Iraq altogether. But previously, the oil was nationalized. Iraq's oil was nationalized, but it was plundered by multinationals. And this is part of how it's partly why they hate Iran so much. And this is partly how they've been able to establish the petrodollar and establish dollar hegemony, is just by basically maintaining a monopoly on the oil in the Middle East. And, the Saudi Arabia has been closely tied with the U.S. I believe they're the top producer, or well up there. So as long as Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all these areas that are heavy in oil only trade oil in the U.S. dollar, the U.S. dollar is going to remain number one. And now the U.S., despite all their efforts and despite trying to destroy Iran for the last 40 years, is seeing that come to an end. And a lot of the imperialist aggression today revolves around energy and the production of energy. Like if you look at where a lot of these anti-imperialist countries are moving, a lot of them are nationalizing their energy industries. And I mean, that's what Russia was doing that made the U.S. so mad. And that's what Nord Stream 2 was. It was a pipeline created by a Russian state energy firm that was bringing natural gas and energy from Russia to the U.S.'s traditional allies in West Europe, like Germany. So Germany was getting cheaper energy. People were heating their homes. People's lives were getting better. But Western multinationals weren't making a profit. So what do? A proxy war project against Russia, and they blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. And that, shows how capitalism acts as a fetter upon production. But we're moving away from that. The U.S. is no longer able to just destroy any country that nationalizes their oil. Iran, Russia, China, this anti-imperialist alliance, Venezuela, I should mention too, largest oil reserves in the world in Venezuela. They're becoming too powerful, and it's happening very slowly. They're playing the long game, and sort of allowing the U.S. to just scream and cry and implode. But it is happening, and this move away from U.S.-Saudi relations and the sale of oil in the petrodollar, the sale of oil in the U.S. dollar could be a qualitative shift, towards a new era of multipolarity and the decline of U.S. hegemony and imperialist domination.
Right. And this is what political scientists, they call it a crisis of legitimacy that we're entering into. Gramsci called it a crisis of authority. And in the Marxist-Leninist tradition, we say that it's the moment when the ruling class can no longer rule in the old way. And quite simply, when you consider the state as an integral state, and you don't separate foreign policy from domestic policy, as many folks who claim the label of Marxist do in the U.S. in order to support Biden. But when you don't separate that and you look at it in how they're interconnected and an integral part of this larger social totality of the American state, you come to realize that if the U.S. is unable to do what it's been doing abroad, that means that they quite literally cannot rule in the old way. That is, one of the essential manifestations of a crisis, of what Lenin and the Marxist tradition considers to be objective revolutionary conditions. And I go over in my last chapter of my book and in my article on the comprehensive crisis, I go over all of these factors that the Marxist-Leninist tradition uses to assess what an objective revolutionary condition is. And I show how in every single one, the U.S. currently checks them all off. And it's heading towards only intensifying how deep it can check each off. So it's a time of tremendous potential if we get our act together. But that's I think the hard part, getting the act together when it's been untogether or not together for many, many decades.
For sure. And it's good to remember, too, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy for the global socialist movement. It had really terrible effects in pushing a lot of communists and communist parties towards liberalism in the imperial core. And we're now overcoming that, and moving forward and returning to Marxist-Leninist principles and a real class-based movement. But it's going to take time. It's going to take time to repair what was done and alleviate the contradictions that exist. But it is possible, which is, I encourage everybody to read Carlos's work and engage with it, because it's, you'd call it the comprehensive crisis in the U.S. And really what this gives us is a comprehensive analysis of what the heck is wrong with the American left. What the heck, we believe that revolution is absolutely possible in the imperial core. Russia was an imperialist country. They were the first socialist revolution. but how do we get there, right? What are the steps that we take? And this is a comprehensive analysis of the state of the current left, and I think some really valuable solutions to the problems we're facing, and some really valuable strategy and direction on what is to be done. So, what is to be done? Maybe you should have named your new book that.
I had to use the outlook, well, not the outlook, but the lens through which I'm analyzing the flaws, which is the purity fetish. But yeah, the last chapter of the book is basically an extension of this article which we released for the second issue of Jazz. And then since I had already presented a shorter version of it in a few panels which were available online, we decided to release it for free on the website. But yeah, I think that I don't have a magic 8 ball telling me what's wrong, and writing down what it tells me. I'm just using the Marxist method and trying to analyze things comprehensively in their development, in their historical constitutedness, in their interconnections, in the relations that things have and ideas have to material forces. And I'm just using the method that I think is the highest expression of scientific rigor, and applying it to our current situation. So I do think that that the issues which I point out are the issues that are at the core of the subjective crisis, and that if we figure out a way to overcome them, that we will have basically all of the elements there for having a social revolution in the U.S. So I've always considered it to be purposeless to write if one doesn't think that the writing that one is doing is in some form grappling with truth, or at least in the process of trying to understand the question of what even grappling with truth means. But and also changing the world according to that understanding of truth, which is being proposed. So I do think that I take what I say there serious. So I do think if people were to do that as well and adjust accordingly, that we would be in a much better position.
I agree. I mean, that's why I like promoting it so much. Obviously, um, promote anything that Midwestern Marx puts out and that you put out, but I genuinely think it's legitimately going to be helpful for people, which is why I'm excited to publish the book. So, yeah, really excited about all the developments with the Midwestern Marx Publishing Press too. Like, we were covering recently that Gray Zone article about Kachinovsky, the guy who's done all the research on Maidan, and basically showed that the snipers that killed 70 people were affiliated with the Maidan protesters, the right-wing U.S.-backed protesters, and revealed all this stuff, that right sector was deeply involved, that the right wing, was leading the protests from the beginning and was the one that escalated them into a violent government takeover with U.S. backing. All of his research is being suppressed, and it's being suppressed by scholarly journals that put him through the peer review process. So this is great work, rigorous analysis, but we're not going to publish it, because of some clearly contrived and invented reason. So they get approved for publishing and then not published, which is why the Journal of American Socialist Studies is so huge.
Yeah.
And why there needs to be academic journals, academic outlets for Marxists, for Marxist-Leninist scholars, because we're currently blackballed and handicapped when it comes to arguing the truth in our fields, even though, like, as someone studying healthcare administration right now, like, Marxism-Leninism is the answer to all their problems, right? If they would embrace Marxism-Leninism, they would realize that the root cause, which today we were conducting root cause analysis in, it was literally called contradiction analysis. It was like they're getting so close to dialectics without getting there.
Well, that's what China calls it.
Right. And I'm like, oh, they must be reading the Chinese scholars. But then, you do the root cause analysis, and the root cause of everything's the profit incentive. It's like, well, you can't question that, though.
And people, especially people that are outside of academia, and even people that are in it, but just in their first few years, they don't realize how how long it takes to publish in scholarly journals. Like you can send out an article to a journal, and if it's like one of the respectable ones, the sort of journal that if you put it on your CV, it impresses an employer, or even it counts as a positive to an employer. These journals take anywhere from 6 months to a year for you to get an answer, and even more for you to get published. So it's virtually impossible to do a political analysis in that form, because political analysis are of a contemporary reality which is in constant change. So by the time the analysis that was done in September on the proxy war against Russia gets published, it's been a year and a half since we've officially confirmed that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up by the U.S. You get what I'm saying? So like it's not a very good way to engage with scholarship that's aimed at attaining truth. And we have to all play this game. Like if I want to, I'm a semester off, 2 semesters off from finishing my PhD. But if I want to have a job, I need to continue publishing for these fucking things that are, some are good, some scholarly work there is good, but, just the form that it takes is not the form that I think Marxist scholarship should be taking. And, part of the benefit, I think, of our institute is that it creates an alternative that is grounded in understanding reality from a proletarian standpoint, using the most scientifically rigorous world outlook, which is dialectical materialism, and understanding the world with the end of changing it, and doing so in a way that is comprehensive in medium as well as in content, which means that the information that we cover in our website, we are likely covering it in short videos and in videos and streams, and we're covering the ideas in a way that everyone gets to engage with them. Maybe we have some things behind a paywall, but you'll still get like distilled some of the essences of those things through videos and stuff like that. That's not the case with the academy. There's a whole bunch of books that I can't like read, at least for the next few years, just because they're $120, and I can't afford that. 95% of my paycheck goes towards rent. And I'm fucking, working 80 to 100 hours a week on scholarship related things. So it's completely absurd. And it gets kind of back to what we were talking about, intellectual property, but it's bourgeois philosophy and beyond philosophy, bourgeois disciplines are just unable to grapple with truth. They have just grown well beyond their ability to have anything that's close to scientific rigor in every field. And that's that's something that we've been saying for a long time, and that we've been showing for a long time. But I think that the rise now in China of a bunch of new Chinese journals that are being read by way more people than the ones that read these like super high impact factor journals in the West, it's gonna come to the fore pretty soon, and it's happening already with some English journals. Which for China to have English journals that are read more than journals out of the U.S. and England, it kind of says something. But
And who wants to read that shit? Like, what regular person wants to read a lot of the journals that you and me are forced to read for school? They're not easily digestible. They're like literally the form that they make you take a lot of the times will, one, suck the truth out of whatever you're trying to research or argue, and then two, like suck the fun out of it. Like usually the truth is fairly simple, and you can explain it in a concise, simple way, but the more academic jargon and long words you have in there, the better, just which makes it undecipherable to normal people, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do with the Journal of American Socialist Studies. It's great research, it's important work, it's based on hours and hours of study and peer review, but it's written in a way for everyone to understand, and it's done, it's colorful, it's made for people, which scholarship in the US is this like locked off thing. It's only for the elites, only those who can decipher the academic jargon or pay for $120 research papers, and it's just a dumb way of doing things. The form that higher education takes in capitalism, makes it disconnected from the masses. And then also like recently I tried to do an analysis of the lab leak theory for COVID and potential cover up surrounding it. And the more my professor revised the essay and made me make changes, the more the truth got sucked out of it. Because the more I was just isolating like this minute detail, like he wanted me to analyze the process of investigation that some NIH institution carried out. I'm like, well, I don't really care about their process, their methodology. What the point is that their methodology was never intended to get to the truth, right? The people running this organization, or the people at the head of the NIH, like Fauci, were covering their own tracks. They were lying. But no, you can't talk about that. You have to talk about the process that this one organization followed, the super technocratic aspect of things. And it's senseless. It feels like a waste of time. And it's after spending a lot of time, years in academia now, I can say that is the form that bourgeois academia takes, whatever college you go to.
Yeah, it takes a scapula to reality and separates things from the other factors that it necessarily exists in interconnection with. And what it produces is an analysis of something that has been killed, right? If you take a hand and you chop off a finger to analyze that finger, and you forget that you have chopped it off from a hand, the properties you're going to find, the characteristics you're going to find, the truth you're going to engage with the study of that ripped off finger is not actually truth, because you've separated it from the context in which the finger is actually a finger. That's just very basic. And that's what you have with all these academic disciplines. It's taking a scapula to the world, separating it from everything else. And the picture of the whole is just completely destroyed. You can't have a comprehensive picture at all. And that has been at the level of philosophy and academic disciplines, a reflection of the degeneration, the moribund character of capitalism. Because at capitalism's height, when it was still a progressive force for humanity, you had these giant figures like Kant and Hegel, who were trying their best to engage with reality, to grapple with truth, to look at things comprehensively, to paint these meta narratives upon which truth is always going to be tied. But then that gets dissolved, and by the 1848 revolutions on, when the bourgeoisie is very clearly a regressive historical force and a conservative force, and it no longer sides with progress, what do you have? You start to have, you get your Nietzsche's and you get your Schopenhauer's, and then you get, these different philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century, and then postmodernism, and this whole host of disciplines that can no longer do what the classical bourgeois philosophers, your Kant and your Hegel, did.
Right. I mean, if you tried to do that, you would be expelled. I mean, you would be kicked out. People would come for your job like they did for me, until eventually I was, pushed out of the academy. And there's a difference between private and public schools, and there's differences between the colleges, but it's all generally the same thing. You're pressured into taking these neoliberal positions, and there are employees or positions at the college where essentially your whole job is just to push neoliberalism, for lack of a better word. So yeah, like I said, at the college I was at, they were hanging up posters everywhere that had, democracies versus authoritarian dictatorships. And China and Russia and Iran were the worst authoritarian dictatorships. And then all the NATO countries were the liberal democracies where there's, freedom, high rates of freedom. And when I saw those, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to last long at this college. I was telling my friends that. I'm like, this is not a good sign, guys. They didn't believe me, but.
Well, where else is there to go? I mean, there's no other school is going, unless you're like cranking out fucking 2 articles a month for like super high rated journals where they can say, okay, this guy believes what he believes, but he gets the ratings of the school up. But then, what journal is going to publish your material if you're thinking in a way that's engaging with truth and contradicting, the irrationality of the existing order, right? So it's just, you either sell out, or you end up like Parenti, blackballed, or you end up like Tom Riggins. He was always an adjunct professor. That means he was never on tenure track. He was never actually able to become what guarantee what the label of professor actually stands for. You have different ratings, assistant, associate, full professor. He was never able to be anywhere near that. He was only contracted on a yearly basis as an adjunct professor. That's why he doesn't like using the title professor. When he talks about his career, he uses teacher. But it's if you want to be a scholar in the land of the freedom of ideas, supposedly, and you want to hold on to genuine Marxist positions, you got to hide them. Or you got to work in an area that's not controversial, work in history and talk about labor struggles from, 200 years ago or something. But don't talk about now. Don't, insofar as you don't talk about now and you criticize now, you're good. But it's, I was being told by one of my colleagues in the academy that they're in a field that I disagree with ideologically, but it's not one of the main fields. And he was telling me about another colleague of his who got hired to be, primarily a researcher. And this person had cranked out articles left and right in professional journals. But the rating that the journals had wasn't high enough. And so they got fired. And then the thing that they said was, how am I supposed to publish in these really high rating journals when the field that I write in is not considered even philosophy by these people? It's considered something completely different. So it's these sorts of they're not even bourgeois structures. They're almost like feudal aristocratic structures that predominate in a form that's mediated through profit logic within the academy. It's just completely absurd. And you hear it and you're like, who the fuck wants to do that? But then if you want to teach, you have to.
Yeah, you do. Or you have to go work for an insurance company like our economics professor in college. Or you have to work for a pharmaceutical company like my professors right now, or USAID. There's like a revolving door now between the academies and finance capital and the State Department and arms of the State Department, which largely was initiated by the Koch brothers and their development of this Coctopus that's detailed in Jane Mayer's Dark Money. There's always been bourgeois control of the academy, especially the elite universities like Yale and Harvard and the Ivy Leagues. But with what the Koch brothers did was systematized, funding through charitable donations, funding colleges in exchange for those colleges teaching right-wing stuff, moving right-wing, hiring bourgeois professors. Especially in the economics department, because the Koch brothers were obsessed with Ayn Rand, sort of trickle-down ideology, probably how they justified their own obscene wealth to themselves, which is, I'm assuming, how they got obsessed with Ayn Rand. But they pushed this Chicago school, Milton Friedman style economics. It was originally cooked up in the Chicago school and exported to Chile with Pinochet, who was advised by Milton Friedman and some other Chicago school economists. They came up with this trickle-down idea. But then the Koch brothers created this apparatus of NGOs and charities who donate to different colleges, give millions and millions of dollars to colleges, to get them to hire people trained up in these Chicago schools, trained up in a pseudoscience that's designed to promote capitalism and keep pushing capitalism forward. And that's what you have, this revolving door between the academies, and you just have this constant funding going into the academies that have made them increasingly bourgeois, or even, like you said, almost feudal, aristocratic in certain ways. And it's sad. It's hard. I'm trying to learn everything I can, man, from my master's program. I really am. I'm getting a good analysis of the healthcare system. I'm learning how it works from the inside. And I'm looking forward to being able to say I have, a graduate degree in healthcare administration, put that on Midwestern Marx articles about healthcare. But at this point, that's all I really care about, because I'd rather die than work for a pharmaceutical company or something. Like, or even I don't even want to teach it, because all my teachers are literally like former USAID people, who are just maintainers of the system, except for maybe one. So
Yeah, I mean, it's not that bad in philosophy, especially because you still have the. At least me, I love reading even the stuff that I disagree with in philosophy. The more contemporary it is, the more infuriating it gets. But I mean, I philosophically despise Nietzsche. Love reading him though, very fun. So it's hard for it to get to a point where it's just not enjoyable, just because I love philosophy in general. But I could see that if that wasn't there, it would be so tremendously difficult just to even do the bare minimum. But
it ain't easy.
yeah, yeah, I know. We have our voice message back and forth, and it sounds like it's extremely hard. But you're
5 minute
almost there.
rant.
Yeah, you're almost there at the finish line, and you'll be able to flex that degree pretty soon. And degrees shouldn't matter because Noah's fucking brilliant. I don't know if he has a degree, but he's just someone who studies every fucking day, doesn't ever stop reading. And I've never known a regular working class dude that I could just talk to about Kant and Hegel. And that's Noah. Like he's just I don't know where he was built, what planet he's from, but he's much more educated than the vast majority of the people walking around with titles. But in the face of this sort of aristocratic-esque formalism of titles, he's nothing. To them, he's nothing because he doesn't have a title. You are your title. So to some extent, it's important. There are, not to say that there isn't things that you can gain from going through a graduate program. There definitely are, but those are not things that it was a zero-sum game getting within the academy. Like I loved studying before I entered graduate school. I could have just kept on studying, and I would have been studying a bunch of other things. You get relationships with professors, which sometimes it's cool. Sometimes you get you say professors, which but it's difficult, and I realize that I'm in a position where I've been able to make good relationships with all my professors as people I've been able to collaborate with to write for academic publications. So it's, within the rubble, it's a relatively privileged position, but you see the cracks and you see the trajectory and what you have to do to get on like tenure track. And it does not seem appealing.
Hopefully Midwestern Marks will be big enough at that point. We don't need to rely on the academy. Also, Noah doesn't have a degree, but he does have the grease.
Oh my God.
That was the first thing I thought of.
The grease.
His 10 the grease outside.
Every time I think to him, he's always going somewhere to eat. I don't know why, but I've never called Noah and he hasn't told me, hey, let me call you right back. I'm at the sub shop, or I'm about to get some fried chicken. It's always something, and then it's always extremely unhealthy food. He's never like, I'm at Salads R Us, and I'm about to get a healthy fruit salad or something.
That's how it is for the working class. It's just gas station food for the blue collar workers, anyway.
He's always like, "You got to try this, dude. When you come to Ohio, I'm taking you here." I'm like, I don't want diabetes, man.
Did you see Dust the other day when he posted?
Oh God!
Our buddy Dust James, he got the double down from KFC. That's like instead of bread, it's 2 pieces of fried chicken. And then our buddy Todd Doherty commented like, "How's your cholesterol, Dust?" He's like, "Talk to me when you're 60 and you're on meds or something."
Oh, did you hear the comment? We were doing the interview with Dr. Monteiro, and he was talking about Winston eating Southern black food. He's like, if you don't eat Southern black food, you're crazy. And it's insanely delicious, but it's like Cuban food. Like every time my mom cooks, it's like a pound of grease, and it's fucking awesome. But my whole family has like cholesterol issues because of it.
Right.
And everyone I know that's Cuban and past 40 has cholesterol issues. But
Worth
that
it.
gets me to a weird segue. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but Team Cuba just classified for the semifinals of the World Baseball Classic. In the U.S., we don't talk about the World Baseball Classic much, in part because Team USA has kind of sucked um, over the last few tournaments. The last one they actually won. It was the first one that they did a really good job on. But
One sec. I'm gonna run to the bathroom. You keep going with this because this is a good segment to do. Because I always talk about wrestling, so now you can talk about baseball.
okay,
I'll
yeah.
be right back.
Well, the it's such a big tournament in other parts of the world, like Shohei Otani. He hit like 2 home runs in an exhibition game in Japan, and it was seen by 36 million people, which is combined more than like the viewership of the Super Bowl and the NBA finals. Like it's an insanely watched event around the world, so it's a really big deal. It's not that big of a deal in the U.S. for some reason, but hopefully it starts turning into a big deal. But Cuba was the first team to classify for the semifinals, and one of the things that Team Cuba is doing this year is that they're allowing players from the major leagues that are Cuban to play for their team. The only exception is those players that deserted, so that they were in international tournaments like the World Baseball Classic or in other tournaments, and they deserted the team. Those are the only people who can't participate. I find that to be, quite fair of a standard. But again, all of these restrictions that Cuba lays are all grounded in the blockade. And MLB, Major League Baseball, is actually against how the blockade imposes certain forms of relations that Cuba can have to the major leagues. So hopefully those things change. But Team Cuba is now in the semifinals. They're playing Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and they're playing in Miami because the semifinal games are done in Miami. And now the Gusano community from South Florida is asking itself, should we support the team? And you go through the comments of any of these pages, and it's pretty despicable. Like 60% of them are saying, all those baseball players are communists. They're all representatives of the government. If they win, then the communist repressive government, can use that to say, oh, look how successful we are at creating baseball players. Lift the blockade, or the government will make it political, and they will make it a gain that's related to the Cuban Revolution, which, I mean, they fucking trained them, so I don't know.
Right.
Maybe they should, but they're politicizing it, and now there's like campaigns that are going to be done so that you have like an organized opposition of the Cuban government in the game on Sunday, protesting, the players and the Cuban government and all that funk. And if there's something that athletes know, especially folks that have competed at a high level, is that psychology is perhaps the most important thing. Your mindset. There's nothing more important than your mindset. You could be the best hitter in the world, but if your mind is thrown off, you're not hitting. And I can't help but think that is something that's going to have tremendous psychological influences, both in the players that are coming from Cuba, the people that play in Cuba, but also in the players that are from here and decided to play for Team Cuba, that are MLB players and said, yes, of course I'll play for my country. So it's so disgusting. And some of the things that you hear these people say, and I've said it before, but the best criticism that you can use against these folks in the eyes of regular people is the things that they themselves say. Like, I made a video a while back when the oil tanks exploded in Cuba, calling for at least a partial lifting of the blockade until Cuba was able to figure that out. And we had people like saying that I should be killed because of that, and just saying these horrendous things. And you show that response to a regular person, you're like, well, okay, who do you think, just judging on the basis of their character, who do you think's position is more rational? The person that's in favor of lifting the blockade, or the person that's in favor of sustaining it? And that adds all of these, long qualifications about the Cuban government without ever having any evidence, who do you think is going to be more correct? So they outs themselves for what they are, which is, in the words of Martí, he called them gusanos de corbata, worms with a bow tie, that are ready at the helm to sell their country for a few dollars. And but now Team Cuba is going to be playing in Miami. It's probably going to affect them having a bunch of idiots there protesting the team. So it's a sad situation. I'm wondering whether my friends in Miami can do something to counteract that, but I know that it'll be disproportionately against them if they do, and it might frankly be dangerous. Like, we have friends from the Troika Collective who are active in the caravans every month that take place in South Florida, and they've had people just been hit and stuff who are just protesting peacefully against the blockade and asking for bridges of brotherhood and fraternity to be built between the U.S. and Cuba. So it's a tough position, and it's one that hits home for me as a former baseball player and as a Cuban American. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's interesting. I remember, this is a weird anecdote, but I remember once being at a wrestling tournament with this guy who was, I don't know, typical American middle schooler, not real educated on geopolitics, but he asked his dad, do you think Cuba tortures their players if they lose? Like, if they don't do well enough, they get tortured, and that's why they're so good. So that's how the American mind thinks, rather than, wow, Cuba's good. They're, what are they doing to produce all these amazing athletes and amazing players? It's, I bet you they get tortured if they lose, and that's why they're so good. As if that would even help. That would just make you super nervous and mess up your psychology, like you were saying earlier. I mean, some people might do good in that kind of situation, that kind of pressure cooker, but not most athletes I know. But super interesting to get that sports angle. I always bring up, there's so many Cuban athletes to bring up. It's really incredible how disproportionately good they are compared to the size of their country and the wealth of their country due to the embargo. But Mijan Lopez Nunez is like the best Greco-Roman wrestler of all time. And I was just looking for the video. You used to be able to find it. There was a video of him saying, shout out to the big boss Fidel, after he won his 4th Olympic gold medal, which is unheard of in wrestling. But it's like, of course he supports the revolution. Like, he's a big Afro-Cuban black man. In Batista's Cuba, he likely would have been, doing plantation labor somewhere. But, instead he was able to utilize his talents and be one of the greatest athletes of all time, if not the greatest athlete of all time in the sport of Greco-Roman wrestling. So that's the kind of potential that the revolution unleashed in Cuba. It's a testament to how great the revolution has been for the masses, which is, I think partly why the Cuban government, Cuban communists put so much into sports, and part of the reason these athletes have so much pride. Like, one of the boxers wrote or had written on the wall of his gym, like, better to be loved by the nation of Cuba than to be rich, or than have all the riches in the world or whatever. Because those athletes are basically choosing their country and their people over a life of wealth and fame and fortune in the United States. And there are so many who take that route. And that's part of the reason it's so admirable to see the athletes who choose to stay. Like, if you look at their wrestling facilities, it looks like what we had at our Division III college in the United States is better than what the Cuban Olympic team has because of the embargo. You can't even import mats. But they still manage to be one of the best teams year after year after year. I also want to add Puerto Rico in the World Baseball Classic smoked Israel, which is just great to see. I've got a bunch of friends in Puerto Rico. I've spent some time there, so that was awesome to see them beat the Zionists.
And Venezuela smoked the Dominican Republic. And, no hate against my DR homies. Most of my training when I was younger was in with Dominican trainers, and it was fucking awesome. You step into the batting cage, and all you have is bachata, old school bachata playing, and it's pretty awesome. But the DR has had right wing and neoliberal governments since basically forever. Not that there isn't a strong workers movement within the country, but there's also a lot of anti-Haitianism and a weird form of racism that takes place in the DR. And we currently have a friend of the Institute, Danny Shaw, over there in the DR teaching. And we just uploaded a segment from one of his class lectures that's titled, how racism is a tool for capitalists and anti-Haitianism, anti-Haitianismo in the Dominican Republic. It's a very good lecture. Check it out, when we're done with the stream. But yeah, the Team Venezuela, they beat the Dominican Republic. So a lot of important wins from socialist countries. Mexico, who's not fully socialist, but a strong left-wing government, they beat the U.S. And their best hitter is like a Cuban, Randy Arozarena. And it's a shame that he's not in Team Cuba because the kid fucking rips. He can hit the ball.
That's funny. There's so many good. Yeah, we talk about the amazing Cuban athletes who compete for Cuba, but then there's so many just scattered around the world too.
Oh yeah.
It's the same thing with wrestling in Russia, and especially when you had the Soviet Union. Like, there were these amazing wrestlers who couldn't make the team in Russia, or they can't make the team, so they just go to Azerbaijan. And then those teams just become amazing and stacked with all these guys from Dagestan and Chechnya.
I heard in terms of baseball, Japan is getting like that. There's like maybe 7 or 8 Japanese players in the MLB, and only like 3 of them were in the Japanese team for the World Baseball Classic. And it was because the other ones weren't good enough. The Japanese league is so good that they literally, the MLB guys from Japan, the vast majority of them were not good enough to make Team Japan.
Holy crap. That's nuts.
But I saw an interesting analysis which was about how a big part of the baseball community has been mad at how the MLB treats like American ball players because it invests so much in facilities around the world. Naturally, because if the more players you have from around the world, the more viewers. And if you have just a bunch of American players, then only Americans are going to watch baseball. And that diversification is to some extent good. But, as someone who had to go through like the reality of if you want to get seen by a scout, you have to pay $700 just to participate in a showcase. And then that means having to travel and stay in a hotel. And it ends up being like a $2,500 experience. And if you want to really succeed, you got to do like 2 or 3 of those a year. Like, I've had friends who their parents had to sell their house, their cars in order to keep up with their child's baseball careers. And it's a whole lot of struggle that goes on. And then these people just look at like folks in the DR who have these facilities for free, and their whole lives are just surrounded by baseball, and they have major league facilities and trainers just for free. They don't have to like go to school for 8 hours a day. They just get schooling for like 2 hours there. And I've had friends who've taken that route to get signed. They're guaranteed to get signed. The rate of signature is like 5 times higher. So it creates a little bit of ressentiment in a lot of the baseball players from America, because they're like, what the fuck, a lot of us have the same skill sets, but we don't get signed, and then we have to pay for basically everything we do. And the vast majority of us come from poor families that sacrifice a lot in order to get the children the opportunities that they got. And so I've seen that going on recently. But
I always felt like, not to say there aren't poor wrestlers who make it to the top too, but my parents sacrificed a lot to send me to a lot of wrestling camps and help me chase my dream. But then there was always, I felt like some kids could afford to fly, so they would fly to Europe, and they would fly to Russia, and they would get training from, where the sport originates and where a lot of the technique originates. And then I would go to these camps with Ben Askren, who was a real famous, he went into the UFC after he was done wrestling. I would go to his camps, which are based in Wisconsin. I'd get a lot better there, but then there would be guys whose parents flew them in, who, were there for a week, and then they were flying to another camp in California. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I can keep up with this. And
Yeah.
usually, you know, those guys were really, really freaking good. So, you know, there's money behind it too, and a sort of sense of inequality in a capitalist country where not everyone has access to things like that. But yeah, I mean, if we had high-speed rail all across the country, I could have done that whenever I wanted. But yeah, I'm about out of energy, Carlos. You got anything else you want to talk about or cover before we call it?
No, I don't know. Do you want to show that Patria
Yeah,
o Muerte?
yeah.
So if I can just explain it a little bit before you play it, because
Go for it.
you know, this is maybe a little bit too in the weeds, but the slogan of the revolution, I don't know if you want to put it forward a little bit until the boxer shows up, because then you got to listen to the Gusanos speaking. Yeah, around there. A little bit before. The slogan of the revolution has been Patria o Muerte venceremos. So homeland or death, you know, will triumph. And Fidel said in like the 90s in a speech, you know, Patria vida. But then for some reason, during these funding, NED and USAID funding campaigns for Cuban artists, Gusano artists in the island, this group, Los Hadianos, and this other group, the San Isidro movement of artists, and the Gente de Zona, and all the like rappers that have came from the island and have relocated to the U.S., they developed the slogan Patria Vida to like counter the Patria o Muerte slogan. So instead of homeland or death, homeland and life. They weren't smart enough to even realize that that was a slogan that was already said by Fidel, you know, a decade and a half earlier. But whatever, that has been like their thing. And what's funny is, you know, before we get into the video, as a Cuban who has, you know, seen the transition of all this music, these people, although they weren't like singing in favor of the government, they were singing against like, you know, the American lifestyle of consumerism. They were singing in favor of like Cuban culture. They even had like pro-Palestine songs and songs against the American war machine. And then they start getting money, and for some reason I don't know, I can't put my finger on what the reason is, but as soon as they start getting money from the U.S. State Department, they start to sing against Cuba. I don't know. Maybe someone out there can figure it out why that transition takes place. But they move to the U.S. They win, you know, the Latin Grammys, and they do all these things, and they live like, you know, multi billionaires, millionaires. So I don't know what happened, what made that transition in the lyrics and in the music, but something must have happened there.
What a coincidence.
What a coincidence, right? That's it. So that was huge because that was at the height of the Patria Vida thing. So you have all these idiots in Miami doing the homeland or life, and homeland and life, and this guy's like, fuck that, homeland or death, we'll triumph.
What a freaking beast. That's pretty cool. I always wondered how politically aware a lot of the Cuban athletes were, and what I've found, you know, is all of them pretty much, because like I said, you have the option of leaving and being a rich and famous athlete, being like Yoel Romero, a UFC fighter and a wrestler who I like. He competed for Cuba as a wrestler, but he ditched to come to America, and his family's still in Cuba. And I remember once, like, Joe Rogan was trying to get him to talk bad about Fidel Castro and communism. He's like, oh, my family's fine. They're still over there. And everyone in the comments was like, you can see he doesn't want to talk bad about the government because they'll kill his family. It's like, or he just doesn't have anything bad to say about him. He's like, oh, I just decided to go be really rich.
Right. Take out Occam's razor and see what's more likely. But they do the same thing. I believe it's Gamboa. Gamboa was one of the best boxers maybe about a decade ago. Gamboa and Rigondeaux. Either Gamboa or Rigondeaux, was one of the two. But they took a picture, like he invited someone over, and they took a picture inside his house, and he had like a Che Guevara portrait in a corner of his house, like half hidden. Like I guess he turned it when the guy got there, but the guy was able to snipe it out, and he took a picture of it. So they've been protesting his fights, calling him a communist and stuff, and it's affected his boxing career so much. Like they pressured a trainer to leave him, and he had to switch trainers, and all of that like affects the psychology. And as soon as you have the trainers shift, it also affects them materially in their training. So it's just so incredibly stupid, and I love saying it all the time, which is something that I say all the time is that the Cuban's worst enemy is the Cuban, because the force which has kept the blockade on Cuba, the strongest force has been the mafia in Miami, and the fucking gusanos, which have so much power. Like even Trump, he was planning on keeping the Obama style policy with Cuba until he had to make a concession with the Florida Republicans to change it. But yeah,
It's wild. I talked about that the other day when I reviewed a video of people trying to do revisionist history and say Trump's an anti-imperialist. Like, you can't. I get that he had anti-imperialist rhetoric and that was good, but he had John Bolton as his national security advisor. He's not an anti-imperialist, and he put the sanctions back on Cuba.
yeah.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us today, everyone. It was a great stream. Appreciate Carlos and Noah joining me for the Iraq War segment and all the other segments. Look forward to Carlos's new book coming out soon. And yeah, anything else?
Yeah, Monday. It's expected to be available Monday, and on Sunday, the 19th at 9 a.m. Eastern time, I will be one of the discussants at an IMG International Manifesto Group, and Midwestern Marx Institute co-hosted event on the Paris Commune. We'll be speaking about the relevance of the Paris Commune. I have some points prepared that I'm not sure if folks will be hearing. Points tied to the history of the U.S. and similar experiments we've had in U.S. history that are largely ignored, not just by the international socialist community, but by the American socialist community, of course. Yeah, if you can tune in at 9 a.m., do so. I believe you'll be able to ask questions. I think we have the link on our Twitter. If not, just go to the International Manifesto Group, and you'll be able to find the event through Eventbrite, I think is the page that they are using. But if not, then we'll be posting the whole discussion afterwards, and probably a clip of my speech or something afterwards as well. So look out for that. And then, yeah, the book, the 20th. I'm very excited. We've gotten endorsements from, the people whose scholarship I admire tremendously, folks like Roland Boer, Gabriel Rockhill, Helmut Radhika Desai, Tom Riggins, just a whole host of people whose work I admire greatly and who have been very influential for the book. So, it couldn't go any better.
Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks, everyone.